12 miles below. By Mark Arrows. Chapter 171 to 180. Book 4, Chapter 31, More Points into Sneak. How's about there? I asked, pointing at the three-dimensional map outlined over our HUD. Cozy spot, I think. Cathita cackled, connecting the dots. Trying to avoid hard work even in this situation. What made this spot different from the other possible candidates with weak flooring was a massive stone pillar that was still standing nearby, which wouldn't stay intact for very long after we showed up and did nightly things to it. Pillar falls over, crashes into ground, collapses floor, and we've got a way down into the second level. Work smart, not hard. Never work hard. I shot back, looking back at my sister for backup. Right, Kedra? If my dear brother isn't trying to avoid hard work, I would consider him a possible imposter. She said drolly, ever my loyal and kind-hearted sister. Windrunner hummed along, in agreement, the traitor. Cutting the pillar down would save a good chunk of time from your way down to the basement directly. Cathita said. Plush squire plan, but it could actually work out. Any objections? I asked to my group of critics. With a few headshakes, our next plan was in motion. And our crew sprinted away like pipe bugs hiding from a searchlight. We'd shaken Tuovilus's eyes on us, but the rat was probably cooking up another plan to get visual on us again. So we kept a close eye around for machine sounds, strange signals, and keeping to the shadows. Halfway through to our destination, we found out what he was up to. Indirectly. A whole series of previously grayed out name tags on our squad list turned back to green, signifying they were once more in comms contact. The team that got split up from us had found a way out of the tunnels, and so were in general comms range once again now that there wasn't a few hundred tons of rocks in between our groups. Away team, come in. This is Isostride Prime, in current command of the split-off tunnel team. Respond. A voice came up on the comms system, following all the standard encryptions. Windrunner picked up. This is Windrunner. Lord Atius is indisposed, I've taken temporary command. Status. We found a way through the tunnel systems leading into the temple. Sending map data now. We'll be attempting to advance into the temple, however it looks like we're some distance from you. There was a ping and update on our HUDs. Anka showed up on the comms not a moment later, having heard and gotten the update. Shadowsong to away teams, should we advance into the tunnels and regroup? Suffocate is no longer active. Negative. Windrunner sent back. Keep a lookout for machine reinforcements. When they come, we'll need to know. You'll redeploy into the tunnels after visual confirmation. Ground team has cleared the tunnels, you should be able to sprint through with little difficulty. She sent back confirmation, returning to her vigil along with her 2 minions and some of the wounded knights we'd left behind. The tunnel team wasn't done with their report, hitting us with bad news next. All teams, be aware, we've run into another feather, capable of phasing through walls with hit-and-run tactics. Black level threat. Black level wasn't something used lightly. That was the most dangerous possible threat assessment knights used, something of the level that would require an entire clan's worth of knights to fight off. Weapons seen in use are as follows: a chain whip, longsword, and 3 night breakers. The Icewing Knight reported. Night breakers? Windrunner asked, just as stupefied as us all. Confirmed. Night breakers. Target's first attacks were to unhook and steal night breakers from us before we knew to beware. He's made further attempts to recover additional night breakers from our team. We've repelled him thus far. Phasing through walls? That didn't sound like Suffoc's kit, and Tuorda didn't show any sign of wanting to even move from his spot. Not to mention this feather was trying to steal my gear. So Tuovilus. Using a chain weapon, hey? Someone's been stealing my ideas on top of my actual gear. He'll phase through walls behind you, unhook the Nightbreaker launchers and phase out again, with the weapon. The clan knight said, continuing his report. We've seen him bait attacks in order to recover the shells. They're ineffective against him, phasing through his ability. Tuorda had gone out of his way to stomp on every Nightbreaker he could, and Tuovilus was out here swiping them up from our team. The feathers were worried about those weapons and taking actions to mitigate how hard we could hit with them. That was worrisome. And also a good sign we had weapons they didn't want to deal with directly if they could avoid it. What's the counter you've devised against theft? Windrunner asked. Nothing groundbreaking or clever, sir. So long as you are situationally aware and prepared, you can twist away and avoid his grab. Holding onto the weapons themselves has proven reliable, but we've seen him attempt to cut the round directly out of the launcher tube. That worked for him? I asked, but surprise was rapidly fading. This was a feather, and they could move like an intercept frigate through combat. And hit just as hard. Negative, your knights improvised against him in time before he could extract the round and run. We've noticed he needs to fully pass through walls in order to rematerialize and affect the world again. It takes him a second. Have full lookouts from all directions, including up and down, he's tried to attack from those directions already. Nightbreakers will be something to be wary of. I like them better when pointed at the enemy. Cathita said. Couldn't have put some kind of lockdown on them? A security feature so this kind of silver scrap isn't something to deal with? Journey's distressed about the idea of having to tank one of your nightmare weapons. Had considered it, I said, sighing. But putting on the micro-rockets behind the shells was more important at the time. Plus I didn't have any good ideas on how to add security. Lock the launcher to be only triggered by relic armors, and they can't be used in case you don't have armor anymore. Lock it by some kind of authentication signal, and I'd need to start putting in a lot of circuitry inside each launcher. A physical key would slow down setting up the launcher, and if we lose it, we're stuck in the wastes with no airspeeder. Excuses, Winterscar. Anka said with a scoff. This is on your head. You've created weapons of destruction with little oversight. I didn't see anyone bringing this issue up when I distributed them around, so excuse me, princess. I shot back. Not to mention there's nothing stopping Tuovilus from simply ripping the Nightbreaker round out itself and swinging it around like Atius had on his second encounter with Tuekar. I'd need to both add security on the launchers and the rounds. That was quickly going from impractical to impossible. Cut the chatter, Windrunner ordered. All knights, note, we've found two possible methods Tuovilus can track you. Windrunner said, he may have direct eyes on your team, specifically with spiders following in the general area out of sight. Additionally, it's possible you have transmitter bugs magnetized on your armor. We'll send the reverse frequency and details you'll need. Now that you're outside the tunnels, you'll need to advance to the Might Forge without being spotted. The armors complied, already sending a data package with what we'd discovered of the little bugs. Make sure you've eliminated all eyes on your team and have an escape plan in action before you jam their signal. You want to vanish into the darkness, and not give the machines any time to triangulate your possible movements the moment you disappear. Knights returned all green on that. I need a threat assessment on Tuovilus, this is the first we've confirmed an attack from him. 3 dead, 4 wounded. The knight immediately answered, alone and with next to no danger to himself, he's already caused a significant amount of damage to our team of fully equipped relic knights. The chain weapons tip has some kind of occult pulse that's caused internal damage in addition to heavy knockback. Used to displace and isolate our warriors. The clan knight said. The chain itself acts like a Nightbreaker's chain would, but there's only one. If it wraps around an armor, the effects are almost instant death. With a sword it's possible to deflect and push the chain off course before it wraps around, the Winterscars figured that out. Transmitting the combat log. How often is he attacking? I asked, watching some of the footage. Only appeared a few times, Master Keith. He stopped once we had begun testing out possible counters. After the sword counter was discovered, he hasn't yet reappeared. Won't allow us any practice. I noted. Figures. Did the most damage he could, and ran once the knights started to mount up a defense. Souls recovered. Confirmed, we've housed the dead knights within our spare soul fractals. They're safe with us. We're carrying armor remnants with us as well. Which meant they'd snapped off a piece of armor that would house the armor's self-repair swarm. It'll take a week or so to bring those armors back online, but far better than to run around with the full armors. We swapped more details, including what we'd gone through as I went through the combat footage. Word on how Lord Atius was incapacitated rattled the clan knights, but they knew the score with a deathless. He couldn't die, and out of all of us, he was the most expendable member if it came down to it. Not a fact the knights liked to think about, but we were on mission. No luxuries down here. And we had a date with an old molding pillar, specifically to ruin its day. Shadow song to all units, detecting movement ahead outside the forest. Anka said over the comms. Good timing that. The group and I were hacking away with blades on a large leaning pillar. From what Cathita confirmed, cutting this down in the right way would hit the ground and knock a hole into the next level down. Windrunner actual, copy. Enemy movement. About to confirm. Scans show a large number making their way here. She said. I don't think it's a convoy of merchants dropping by. I said, might want to assume it's evil and head down to rejoin the clan knights. A few more careful swipes from our occult blades and the pillar started to groan. Rocks began to break away in puffs of white dust, as the entire thing started to lean. Windrunner hurried to the right side, boot lifted up, convincing the massive thing to fall in just the right away. The Winterscar has it right. Shadow songs, fall back into the tunnel system and regroup with I1 and the rest of the knights. Understood. She said, then paused. Locke confirms the approaching movement is a machine army. Or the start of one. We have it on our scopes. Chance of holding them off? Windrunner asked, voice making it clear he didn't expect much. Non-existent. Anka said. In open terrain, we will not hold for long. Even with our advantages. The pillar finally gave in, the last bits of rock holding it up cracking into pieces. It began to topple down in an arc, right to open ground. When it hit, the ground caved in with little resistance. The cloud of particles left behind was tinted red, showing some kind of working light system within the temple's closed-off section. Right then, back to the original plan, see if you can regroup with the main forces. Windrunner ordered. Bring your wounded with you, the larger group will be the safer location. Continue primary objective of reaching the Might Forge. We'll likely need the backup by the time you arrive. Confirmed, Icewing Prime and his clan knights sent out over the comms. We'll look for the shadow songs as they come out of the tunnels. A confirmation ping came back, the shadow songs moving on to their new objective. I've got a possible idea. I said. On how we can make use of this. Oh. Windrunner prodded. I'm all ears. See, Evelus doesn't know where we are anymore, but he likely knows where the clan knights are right now. They haven't yet found a good spot to pull off a disappearing act yet. So when the shadow songs meet up with them, they could start heading to a location opposite of us, and not quite near the Might Forge. Evelus might think they're coming to link up with us. And in the process he'll send more forces in that direction. Kedra completed for me. That could work. So long as he doesn't think we're underground, we get some extra points into sneak. I said, walking over to check out our new way down. And speaking of extra points, the underground basement level looked quite nice for that. Kedra and I landed down, deep into the wet gloom. Large puddles spread across the ground here, getting filled up further from the waterfalls of the upper levels water spilling down. The red tint in the air turned out to be from the wall lights, where the mites had embedded some kind of haphazard crystals that glowed. I found myself near one, tapping it with an idle finger, trying to figure out if the crystal itself emitted light, or if they were decoration for an actual light. Wrath. I sent out. How good is machine sight? Say within your runners? Similar to humans in quality. Although infrared spectrum is included, the wavelengths captured are otherwise identical enough. Then they'd have a hard time looking out for things in the dark that don't emit heat? They would. She confirmed. How do you intend to do that? I looked at the crystal decorations around the wall, reaching out with the soul sight and finding what I thought was going on. Turns out mites do cut corners, they were all regular glass crystals. And the light behind, all wired. If there's wire, then there's a power source. And if we could cut out all the lights underground, we'd have the advantage. Night helmets had a lot more sensors than just visuals. They frankly had far more sensors than any armored suit really needed, but now it was coming in handy. Here would be an excellent lesson in why more sensors were better than less, even if most of the data was junk. They had less and we had more. We had a team on the top level that could run distractions, say exploding something near a power source for plausible deniability. A power source that could potentially light up all of the basement level. We could see in the dark. And the cheap mass-manufactured machines couldn't. Book 4, Chapter 32, Under the Temple. Somewhere up on the surface, a heavy explosion took place, multiple stacked grenades lighting up and ripping apart the temple ruins. At the very same moment, my occult blade cut through massive power cables deep underwater, spreading out from the floor. Kedra and Windrunner each cut their own respective cables at the same time, and a few more cuts later, there wasn't a single power cable still whole. The briefing had mentioned the basement level was flooded. That part was true. What they hadn't mentioned was that it was an entire river down here. Our movements made no sound we could hear, even with us being the ones making it. Mostly because everything was drowned out by the sound of the running river we'd found ourselves waist deep in, a dull constant roar that crashed against distant walls. The strong current that constantly threatened to swamp us, given we were all carrying stuff in awkward angles, including keeping our rifles elevated out of this whole mess. They could still work if they took a dip in the bath, so long as there wasn't a puddle of water left in the barrel. Ammunition rated for military use were all sealed, keeping the powder safe. Undersiders had even more reason to make sure their ammunition was waterproof, since they might actually run into the issue while surface dwellers had very little chance to run into any kind of water that wasn't frozen solid. Still, no reason to take chances until it was necessary. A rat in a sack couldn't complain too much about getting an impromptu dip in cold water, the rifle might. The basement level of the temple had stark differences from the above layer. For one, it wasn't stone down here. A lot of the temple showed signs of being flooded, only now left with water fountains from the walls spraying out water into the puddles on the ground, which streamed down, forming small rivers. Metal-lined walls and flooring, with red crystals jutting from the ground. Above the river, suspended in the air in smaller groupings, were blocks of red or white, opposing the organic archways and smooth walls. Never in the path we needed to walk through. Sometimes entire pillar sections were eliminated, replaced by the geometric cubes floating around as if they were part of the pillar holding an arch or ceiling up. The lights were far more down to earth, with power sources that made sense. The wiring led us all the way here, where a mess of larger cables became visible. It looked like snakes all slithering out of the ground to a nest under the water. The closer we'd come to the Might Forge, the deeper the stream became, until everything was waist deep. I'd been expecting it to go up to my chest, so the briefing had been exaggerating, or water had slowly evaporated out over the years. This was easily traversable. Once we'd gotten to the source of power, all we had to do was wait for the sound of an explosion. The surface team hadn't gone lightly with it too, the detonation we heard echoed through the tunnels, even over the sound of the rushing water. I expected the world to turn dark instantly after we'd cut the power cables, instead the red lights held. Which wasn't according to plan. Was there a backup source of light? Just as I was about to call our plan a bust, the red around us started to fade, darkness slowly growing around until it wrapped everything in a tender hold. Oh, day. Capacitors. I said, realizing we'd done the right job. The last bits of energy were bleeding out. Whatever Reacher jargon that is, I'm glad the plan's working. Windrunner said. The surface team should be heading to the Might Forge now, we can beat them there and prevent any ambush getting together. They shouldn't see us coming. My HUD lit up with a wireframe image of the surroundings, not quite details but enough to traverse the now pitch-black flooded terrain with little issue. First objective is information gathering. Windrunner said. In the dark, we'll be able to move around and avoid patrols if we run into them. The water will hide the sound of our footsteps, and it slows both us and them down equally. Second objective is possibly eliminating rogue patches of stranded machines if we can. Is that at all possible? Maybe if we can jam their signals? Underground there's a lot of stone for signals to bounce around, the walls here are full metal so nothing's going through. Wouldn't be out of the ordinary for groups to go in and out of connection as they move around. I said. I don't believe that is a good course of action. If we fail for any reason, two of us will know something is destroying his forces underground and react accordingly. Kedra said. We should use the darkness to map out where they are setting ambushes, and attack all at once when we're ready. Windrunner hummed, thinking quickly between the two options. Kedra's points are valid, he said. We'll stick with the primary objective. Secrecy is more valuable than eliminating a few packs of isolated machines. If we can get the drop on to Sefit and eliminate her, it'll be more valuable than any amount of machine kills. What are we going to do with Captain Sagrius and Atius? Kedra asked, shifting the Winterscar captain on her back. I was busy carrying Wrath, while Windrunner was in charge of the clan lord. He'd gone unconscious a few times since, his condition bouncing between recovering and getting worse. We could carry one deadweight, but 3 was going to drag us down in these flooded tunnels. The current was strong, and the added surface area was giving our relic armors a run for their scrap. Anytime we hit combat, we'd need to unstrap before we could do any kind of movement. They might get swept away if we're not here to stop it. If it comes down to it, I'm fear we'll need to leave them in the dark someplace safe while we handle the machines. There's no choice on this. Windrunner's helmet turned to me, outlined in green on Journey's vision. Keith, Tennycent, you've got until we reach the Might Forge to figure out something to do with your captain. After that, we'll need to hope Lord Atius regains his senses and takes care of your captain while we're away. On the necklace Zagreus had equipped, Father's voice carried out. We understand. The other knights and I still have a few more options to explore. We all know the mission comes first. If it comes down to it, we'll try to bring his soul with us instead. Our only issue is that artificial souls aren't easily moved out of a fractal, they seem rooted on a conceptual level, tied to their homes. And Zagreus was intertwined with his armor's soul, so he was stuck with the armor. That was making things difficult. Can we physically cut out the armor's soul fractal and carry it with us? That's what we intend to call for as our last resort. We are touching on subjects outside our mortal ken, boy. Caution is needed. For all we know, we may bar him from an afterlife. Windrunner nodded while he undid Atius's relic armor helmet off his shoulder pad, fastening it onto the comatose Deathless. While the river obscured any kind of footsteps, a coughing Deathless might be different enough to be noticed. We'll have to go with this for now. Lord Atius can be left behind without issue. If he dies, he'll reappear somewhere he's already been. The worst case is that we lose his armor down here, and that's not the same kind of blow that it used to be a few months ago. He would understand. Zagreus, not so much. I hope for his sake something is figured out between you all, because we're running out of time for him. As Tencent said, the mission comes first. If everything goes exactly as hoped, we may be able to loop back for him on extraction. Wrath only needed the control and command nodes of her nanoswarm fixed up, and just enough of her head to access them. From there she could repair the rest of the damage herself. The Might Forge didn't need to repair her to full health. Although given that an army of machines were approaching, we might need her completely repaired and helping us sigh the way out. An army of screamers wasn't as dangerous to us if we worked as a group. The feathers were the part that complicated things. It might end up that the only way out was to destroy Suffocate and Tuvalis both, before we could take on whatever he'd managed to drag here as a first wave. Suffocate in specific. If she was alive, the machines could dogpile on us and let her turn the entire melee into smoke and ash, friend and foe alike. With a communal nod, our group began to advance towards the center of the temple, where the Might Forge was outlined. It would be slow going, with a lot of dead ends and having to redouble back. We had no map of the second basement layer, only a general sense of direction. It would have to do for now. I thought about what we could do for Zagreus on the way. Father had the soul aspect covered. He and the other knights stuck in limbo were the best bet we had, they had nothing else to focus on. So any solution from me had to come from the armor itself, a solution from technology. I put to mind all the armors could do. Root administrators could do absolutely everything. General administrators could do more things than guest users, but it still needed the local user to approve anything over remote command. I was a general administrator, but Zagreus was in a coma and unable to consent to anything. There had to be something I could work with here. The outline of a plan came to mind. Something that might just work if the rules were squinted at. Armor sought to protect its user in any way it could. If it had a chance to squint at the rulebook, it would. And we were in territory not covered by any rulebook right now, which is exactly the kind of land I was more than happy to run around in. Journey, pull up Zagreus's armor specs. I asked, looking over the list sent over. His armor showed it was manufactured earlier than Journey, though the schematics it followed were the version 1.2 of the armor, while Cathida's was 1.5. It was odd that an older version of armor was created later on, while Cathida's armor was a more advanced version. The specs and abilities between the armors looked somewhat identical, though Journey was a little stronger with different synthetic muscle fibers in new places. Journey had a better range of motion as a result. Software-wise, a bunch of numbers and jargon was there, though it looked identical to Journey's. Guess that means the difference between versions is only raw capability, nothing was touched software-wise. And both older and newer versions were crafted by the Mites to this day. The captain had named his armor Aegis, after an Imperial Crusader who'd appeared in one of our stories. That tale was about a retainer knight fighting off a slaver attack, and left to die within one of their fortresses. Aegis had remained at the side of the hero, even though he had no orders to remain, and ultimately held the line against 3 enemy knights long enough for the hero to finish unlocking an airspeeder where they all escaped. The tale had been about the heroism of the knight, but also a nod to the imperial religion on their own long-standing friendship with the surface clans. Given the armor had been taken from slavers attacking the Winterscar compound, Zagreus must have found the name of an imperial knight that protected the hero against slavers to be fitting. Aegis, if you are tied with your user and any motion you make is mimicked by him, are you able to move yourself around through him? Unknown command. No default instructions set. The armor said, the voice coming out of both Zagreus and over the comms since the two were too tangled together on the soul level. The inflection in Zagreus's vocal cords were the only difference between his armor's monotone voice, and his own. Creepy as it was, so far so good. What's that supposed to mean? Windrunner asked, confused. No default instructions. If my armor-to-human translation is correct, I think it means Aegis isn't moving Zagreus because it wasn't programmed to move a human around. It doesn't know what to do, so it defaults to doing nothing. That seems odd. Kedra said. It can speak with his mouth, isn't that moving the captain's body in a way? Perhaps it can access the captain's muscle memory. If you asked a newborn baby to start running a lap and swimming in the baths, the only thing you'll get is a very angry mother calling security on you, if you're lucky. But more probably beating you up with a crowbar. Ask a baby to do something it already knows how to do, like cry a lot, it'll be perfectly happy to scream. Same with the armor. It knows how to speak, but it doesn't know how to move independently, even if it should be perfectly able to. Got to think more like a program and less like a human. They follow a very strict rulebook, I need to give it something like a guiding hand. Or another rulebook it can follow. So where are you going to get a rulebook on how to move around from the ground up? Windrunner asked. Here's the good news. I know exactly where a rulebook like that exists. Aegis, I called out to it, taking my gamble. Do you recognize me as an administrator? I did have that designation, given by Tsuya herself. It should still be active and recognized by other armors. User, Winterscar, Keith. This user's permissions are currently set to General Administrator. Aegis said with that eerie echo. Good, that means I've got wiggle room to bend the rules with. Now it's time for my master plan. If I couldn't get Zagreus back on his feet, I could go for the second best option. Aegis, is it possible to create a predictive model of Captain Zagreus? Book 4, Chapter 33, The Might Forge. Insufficient user data to generate predictive model. 3,000 operation hours required for predictive modeling to pass acceptable % accuracy. 20,000 hours recommended before diminishing returns reached. Zagreus said from Kedra's back as our group marched through the river. Does that mean your plan doesn't pan out? Windrunner asked from the front. In my defense, I never said all my plans work out. In fact, historically, most of them don't. You are filling us all with great confidence here. He answered back. I gave a shrug. That's what Plan B, C, and D are for. At least, once I figured them out. Give me a second to think. If I couldn't get a rulebook from the source himself, I'd settle for another rulebook closer to home. Can the Winterscar Amor send motion data of 10 cent? I asked. Or better yet, the combat engram itself if Winterscar hasn't deleted it yet. Winterscar confirms it still has the data at 120,449 hours. Kedra said, there's also a file with a warning symbol flashing next to it on my HUD. I believe this is the actual engram. What's all the Reacher jargon about? Windrunner asked, recognizing the words but not the context behind it. You weren't around to see it, but we had Winterscar generate a predictive model of Father's movements and combat skills. It worked, and then the occult happened at the same time, so half worked. I turned my attention to Kedra. If I had to guess, it hasn't deleted the engram just yet, but instead it's keeping it under quarantine. It has, let's say, opinions about that engram. Wasn't a great time for it. Because, you know, occult. Windrunner nodded slowly, not sure I understand, and we don't have time to explain it all to me. If it could work, do it. If it doesn't work, leaves us right back to our current plan. 2 possible plans are better than 1. Aegis, can you reuse that combat engram? I asked. Hoping it would give me the answer I wanted it to. The armor processed the request, a noticeable pause in the calculations. Which wasn't normal for armors. Loading signs are showing on the HUD. Kedra answered my unworded question. I believe the armor is sending more than the engram. Kathita, what are the armors saying to each other? I asked, curious to the gossip going on in the background. Blah blah blah, danger danger danger, don't touch it or turn it on. Spooky occult pyrite is going to happen. Users are being morons and setting you up. The usual scrap shit, she said, bored. Your family armor had a pretty traumatizing experience and is still healing up parts of its soul that your father ate when he took the pilot seat by force. Being a bit of a drama queen though. Journey doesn't agree with its conclusions, thinks it is putting its own self-preservation above the user's, which is a very big no-no for armors. They're all more surprised your family armor is so adamant about this and processing the validity. All right, I was now a little worried Aegis wouldn't want to cooperate given what happened to Winterscar. The last time, Father's soul used the combat engram as a conceptual crack in the ice to sneak inside with all the subtlety of a crowbar. Should it ease their fear, I was the one to choose to take advantage of the opening. What happened to my armor was my doing. Father said from his necklace. The resonance felt like an open path, and I made the decision to walk through it with force. Should it happen again to this armor, I won't interfere. I give my word on this. My armor, you mean? Kedra corrected. Affirmative. Aegis eventually said, deciding to take the chance, either out of its own conclusion or because of Father's promise to not try anything. Combat engram data received. Verified valid file. Warning, potential virus noted and confirmed by file source, designation, Winterscar. Threat level calculated with intolerances. Winterscar remained carefully quiet on this. I got a feeling it was brooding, but that might just be me humanizing relic armors. Even Cathida was just Journey pretending to be the old bat and answering as the old bat would. Wait, let me get my weasels in line with their pipes here. You're trying to get the armor itself to move around using your father's movements as the rulebook? Windrunner asked, picking up on the plan. I flashed him a thumbs up. Yep, if we can't get the captain back on his feet, we could go for the next best thing, get the armor moving around so it won't be dead weight. It won't help Zagreus directly, but we won't need to leave him behind. Windrunner whistled. Lord Atius wasn't kicking the snow about Reachers and what you've been up to. Consider me a convert if this works out, kid. The old bat gave her bits of unasked for advice. That said, how are you going to get past the local user permission? Last I checked, your captain here is out cold. Journey and the rest of the armors are trying to figure out a way past this lock, but they haven't hit any gold yet on that front. Local user permission? Windrunner asked, taking a closer look at the captain. Yep, that's a thing with armors. I said. Watch. Aegis, activate the engram to help you move around and fight. Remote override rejected. Insufficient permissions. Root level permissions or administrator and user permissions required for remote override. Aegis said in Zagreus's strange voice. Anyway, you can just read and copy the engram movements, without applying them to the armor. I pressed on, trying out my different options before I had to go with the crowbar version. Unknown command. No default instructions set for this action. Zagreus said, the armor not used to moving a human around even if it had an engram telling it how to move. We needed the engram online and working as the actual driver, leaving the armor at the pilot seat instead of the engine room. Tell me the specifics on how to authorize autonomous locomotion. I asked, moving on to Plan C. All features that require autonomous locomotion are locked, requiring both physical user confirmation and administrator permission, or root administrator permissions. Local administrator permissions are waived only if no local users are active. Word for word what Journey had told me all that time ago, when I was a bumbling kid trying to cheat as much of the system as I could. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Local user is still alive in there, so Zagreus is considered active. You've got my permission, a general administrator. Now, you need Zagreus's permission, right? Affirmative. The armor said. Good. And since your soul is currently puppeteering Zagreus somehow, repeat after me, remote override approved. Sure, it wasn't Zagreus himself approving the request, but the armor's safety locks weren't intelligent. They were simply hardwired protections, a separate system armors couldn't touch or interfere with by design. That safety hardware heard the local user vocalize approval, and it wouldn't ask any other questions. Remote override approved. The armor dutifully said, and in doing so, made Zagreus say it as well. Aegis must have already caught on, because the very next words were very familiar to me. Releasing safety locks. Loading cognitive engram. Isolating model to directed assisted movement. Full cognitive engram, online. I held a breath, but there was no occult pulse this time. No crackle of lighting, and no show of force. Father remained inside the necklace, at least from what I saw in the soul fractal. Sure, he and the others all had their tendrils busy trying to keep the captain's soul together, but if Father saw a hole in the armor, he ignored it. And Zagreus remained connected with the armor's soul, no change happened to it either. Instead, Captain Zagreus reached his arms behind his back and unhooked himself from Kedra's armor as if it were natural, falling down into the flowing river, up to his waistline. Wordlessly, he turned and began to march forward, taking a spot behind Windrunner and Kedra. The two stopped, looking over at the armor as if it had sprouted a few heads, which it might have for all we knew. Agis stopped and glared at the two ahead. A beat passed, then it cracked its neck to the side, hand going to the hilt of the blade, while the helmet turned to examine the surroundings, as if searching for danger. The same kind of movement Father did whenever there was a hold-up. It was eerie. Extremely eerie. Aegis, are you okay? I asked, and watched as the armor turned its faceless head my direction. This unit is prepared for combat. It said, the voice remaining monotone with Zagreus's echo mixed in. The Winterscar Tenniscent combat engram will be used to guide all further motion. No abnormalities detected. All systems working with intolerance. Windrunner gawked, then shrugged, turned, and continued the march forward. No idea how any of this occult reacher scrap shit works, but ain't going to kick snow into a gift box just because the wrapping's weird. If Zagreus can move and fight, that's all I care about. Cathida cackled. Oh, it can do that all right. And this time around, none of that spooky hocus pocus. All within what Journey and the armors understand. Mind you, it's not going to fight as well as the old man did, or me of course. I'm better than any of you louts, but it'll work out well enough. What, should we have loaded your engram instead? I asked. It was possible, we could swap it out. Father had beaten Cathida within the digital sea when we'd practiced, but that was his true self. This was just data mimicking his prior movements. Oh no, not at all. Cathida said. Best set of data here would be your father's. Crusader techniques are widespread against the lower strata machines, but we're fighting upper strata machines here. Surface Knights know this enemy and have plenty of tools to deal with them just as well as Imperials do. And surface techniques are a better match against feathers. Crusaders don't fight and win against those, not worth wasting time to train against, we leave those for the deathless. So why all this boasting about being better? Windrunner asked, confused. The old bat never admits to anyone being better at fighting than she was. I said. She lies like she breathes when it comes to that. You get used to it. Don't do much breathing anymore these days, dearie. But you got the basics of it. Cathida cackled. Now, get moving, Empire isn't paying per hour. Crazy engram. In the dark, our group of four pressed forward. The river's pole crashed and buckled against the red crystals and walls of the underground temple, creating an echoing cacophony that overshadowed any sound we made. The river slowed us down slightly, relic armor having little trouble powering through. If we hadn't been in armor, we'd have gotten pulled off our feet and swept down with no resistance given how violent it had gotten. Progress was steady until we ran into machines. We saw them well before they were even in a position to see us. Machines, for whatever reason Relinquished had chosen, glowed violet. Especially their eyes. It wasn't much, but it did reveal their position like a beacon in this much darkness. Wrath had to keep her own shut down to avoid the glow, which effectively blinded her to everything save for what scraps of data Journey graciously sent over. The screamers waded through the stream, moving as a single file line, trying to keep the majority of their body out of the water as they pushed on. 20 of them in this group. The one leading ahead constantly had one hand stretched out, holding onto the side of a wall for guidance. The rest followed behind, one arm reached out to keep hold of the front runner's back. Given the proportionally massive arms and loping gait they took on, not much of them was completely submerged in the water. It let them move through the stream, almost spider-like. Keeping one hand busy to make sure they wouldn't lose each other was what truly slowed them down. We froze as a group the moment we saw them. They came closer, their gait not showing any sign of difference, even as Journey revealed more details in wireframe. We all took a collective step to the other side of the large tunnel, the one they weren't holding onto for guidance, and ducked under the water. Rifles and all. The rest of our hands were holding onto the hilts of our weapons, ready to draw them out and destroy this group at the slightest hint of hostility. Their outlines weren't distorted as we sank, crouched low into the water. They passed us by, completely oblivious of our existence. Wrath was right, their vision wasn't any better than a human's. Windrunner drew a hand out, and motioned for us to follow. They didn't howl or make any of the usual noises screamers made when hunting around as a pack. These were clearly under orders. And if the thick walls did prevent orders from being sent out, this group must be on their way back to an important chokehold or backup site, likely the Might Forge itself. While they didn't do an all-out rush, their movements were still moving with haste. They'd speak to each other using clicks and whistles, violet glowing eyes illuminating next to nothing but the side of the walls and tinting the white froth of the river a light purple. Almost impossible to hear over the river noises, but our armors had excellent hearing as part of their scanning suites. And behind the machines, our group stalked a short distance away. Too far for them to overhear anything. Not far away enough for us to lose them. We kept as much as we could submerged, leaving us virtually invisible to any of the machines taking a curious glance behind them into the darkness. Not that it happened, the machines walked with little fear. As time went on, we drew closer and closer to the position marked on our map as the Might Forge. Light came through on the other end. The machines crossed the threshold, gripping onto the sides of the tunnel and lifting themselves up one at a time, out of the tunnel and out of our sight. Our group continued cautiously, fighting off against the current, staying underwater to take a peek at what lay on the other side. Here, we found our objective. Windrunner cursed, breathed a bit, and cursed again. Now what? Gods be damned, we'll need to kill those two feathers before we can retreat, and all that for nothing. A massive ring of space stretched out before us, where all paths into the basement level led to. Massive ornate stairwells connected down from above, the second upper level winding into the sanctuary here in between the pillars that held the tower above. The center of the temple. The space here was huge, an outright ringed walkway surrounded the location, as wide as the main streets of the Undercity. But the edge had been clearly sliced off in small directed cuts, exactly the kind of damage to Suffocate could do if her plates moved during her shots. It made the entire ring edge look more like a large multigone. I realized now why the area was noted down as simply flooded, rather than the powerful currents we'd run into. Why some of the sections further away were wet and filled with puddles instead of water. The water was coming here from all directions, falling off the central hole like a waterfall. More water than whatever the mites had made to keep the temple supplied. What's better than having to defend an objective? Not having any objective to defend in the first place. Tuovilus couldn't destroy the Might Forge, but he sure could cut everything holding it attached to the temple and then let the whole thing fall down into the second strata below. This might complicate things slightly. Book 4, Chapter 34, Improvising. Water rippled over our group of submerged insurgents, trying to drag us out into the open, outside the tunnel. The effect was rather interesting. The anti-gravity field the temple had for people jumping down to the second strata was still well and working. Thousands of water drops floated around, split from the churning water as it flowed down into the hole. The weakened gravity quickly became only a minor force down there, with the power of the current becoming the dominant force, causing a whirlpool of water blocking its own path down. Otherwise a hole this large would have already drained the entire place clean of water by now. It was creating its own funnel in a way. The metallic debris floating through the water equally made everything under the whirlpool completely unreadable. No signals were going in or out through it. Relic armor let us hold onto the ground, despite the torrent washing over us. And while physics was clearly drunk on vacation a few meters away, where we were right now it wanted nothing more than to wash us down into the gullet leading into the second strata down. Meanwhile, we were having a get-together and discussing issues with leisure. The Might Forge wouldn't have broken down, it would have floated down gently. I said, pointing out the anomaly. So good chances it's still in one piece working down there. Abraxas had been the one to tell me about the anti-gravity function, but fortunately I didn't need to rat his name out since it was clear to everyone here what was going on. Or at least, clear to the armors who could do the number crunching required to figure out what the new gravity coefficient had to be to cause this kind of build-up a few meters away from us. Surprised this feather wouldn't just destroy the forge in the first place. Windrunner said. Is it really indestructible? If they were destructible, the machines would have already eradicated any forge near human cities instead of committing entire armies to hold them down. Kedra countered, logical as always. Might forges are destructible. Wrath corrected. Although generally not acceptable as targets. Mites are known to retaliate with maliciousness and spite. This is why machines must surround forges with armies to keep them out of human hands, instead of destroying them directly. But moving it around is acceptable. Windrunner asked, pointing to the circus happening outside the tunnel. Seems to be bending the rules here. No. Might forges are conventionally unmovable. Tuovilis has found an edge case and abused it. One moment, go back a bit. Are you saying might forges are smart and can hold a grudge? I asked, a little incredulous. Are we talking about a tool station or some kind of creature here? More of a creature than a tool station. Might forges need to be bargained with in order to gain access. Demands range from future favors owed that are never called on and forgotten about, or exotic material. They have been known to demand items they are able to forge themselves as well. It is redundant and arbitrary. Wouldn't someone be able to tell them to create the item and then feed it back to them as payment for other items? Kedra asked. That hardly makes sense from any point of view. That's actually exactly how it worked last time. Windrunner said. I've run into a forge just once so far in my years. The forge demanded pieces of relic armor in exchange for medicine, and further repairs to our relic armors. We detached a few shoulder pads, threw them into the forge, and it both created the pills we needed and reforged new shoulder pads for us all. Didn't understand how that worked then, still don't question it now. Comms clicked for a second for all of us, a quick one-way set of pings. That meant the surface team had slipped the noose and were now sneaking around. Direct audio comms might get intercepted at this range, so ambiguous quick pings that could bounce around chaotically until they reached us was the best way to communicate safely. The surface team was reporting in, approaching the central location. Anka and the Shadow Songs had also joined up with the group since there was a final burst of static at the end, and the 2 clicks meant they had found a good opportunity to escape all eyes without issue. Some good news for once. We need to come up with a plan of action. Windrunner said. The main force will be arriving into a possible death trap, all for nothing now. Right. Needed to improvise on the plan here. Situation, there are 2 feathers looking to murder us all, one deciding that it wasn't enough to bring a gun into a sword fight, she had to bring airspeeder cannons. 2 dozen just to be safe. And the other was on his own ratshit, only in his own unique way. Pulling off every possible cheat in the book and then writing another. Additionally, the area was crawling with machines forming up at different choke points, and there may or may not be a giant mythical machine bird flying around. Oh, and our main objective was likely an entire mile under us now, at the very bottom of the desert strata. The one General Zong's info had listed some kind of lightning-like storms that kept the place interesting, which would only get more interesting given the entire place was getting rain for the first time in decades. Wrath, I asked. Mission's not looking good right now. If you abandoned your shell, what would happen? Could you hide in the digital sea? To transport my soul, I must do so through the Unity fractal. It is possible to hide in the digital sea, but my soul would reside in a catacombs, a location filled with spare unused soul fractals all linked in rows. Mother could have me eliminated at her leisure, she controls all these locations. All right, guess that's out as an option. Anyway, we can move your fractal over to a different shell? Come to think of it, we do know a spare shell lying around. To Ekars. Could we rip out the internals and put you in there? Then you fix it up back to your liking later. Or rip off the parts we need to fix you up and graft them on you. It's possible we could transplant that shell's command and control nodes into my own shell. From there I could repair the rest. However, the shell was heavily damaged and nearly unable to repair itself due to the nightbreaker round it took. I do not give this plan a high chance of working out. I could feel her hesitance. Wrath's schematics were wildly different from Tuetisar's given her modifications and generation difference. And she wasn't sure if that final battle had eaten up the rest of those nodes in the first place. Once General Zong had his hands on the broken shell, he'd brought it to his engineers and they'd begun to disassemble it bit by bit. Too much uncertainty there. Would Psia have a way to repair your shell? I asked, looking down the last option I could think of. She might have her own connections, maybe a spare might forge in her bag somewhere? Kathita. The old bat gave a verbal shrug. How would I know, dearie? I was trusted to swing her sword, not balance her books. The temples on the surface certainly didn't have anything that made them stand out other than being a terminal to speak to her. They did look quite impressive, but only from an architecture point of view. Also checked out with what I'd learned of the surface. She wasn't going to put a might forge, which machines sought out with fanatical zeal to lock down and control, directly in a location she didn't want attention shined on. It seems to me, Kedra said, that our options fall to choosing where we fight. In a desert, or at another might forge. Either that or give up entirely on fixing up Wrath for this lifetime. Windrunner said with a shrug. We all turned to him. The girl's immortal, right? Let the next generation after you take on the burden, once the machines stop looking around for her. Mother will know I am still alive. Wrath protested, a bit of panic in her mind. Tuovilis is also immortal and will not stop seeking me out. Got to agree with her here. I said. We can't just stick Wrath up in a locked archive as our clan oracle for a few decades. But wouldn't the feather minx be miserable without a body to move around? Cathida said. The violet goddess might see that as a fitting punishment. Knowing her traitor is still alive, and trapped in a broken body for eternity. In a sort of sadistic light, it checks out. Wrath's feeling of panic increased, with a realization that Relinquished would very well be exactly spiteful enough to see this as a fitting fate. It's not Relinquished we have to worry about. I said. Tuovilis is hunting Wrath down. He's not under the geese that Relinquished is when it comes to the surface. And he's smart enough to work around limitations. Let's keep that as a final option if we really can't find a way through all this. How hard is it to get back to the surface from the second strata? I asked, looking to Windrunner who would be the only one in this team that might know. Cathida answered before he could. Is your head filled with lead? She hissed. There's a desert at the bottom there, need I remind you, dearie? You know, those wide-open grounds where a metal bird bitch from hell can nail you from 36 miles away and hang you out to dry like a purple fish rack. It would be the less dangerous option, in truth. Windrunner said. We would only need the Might Forge to repair Wrath's command nodes, and then move to hide among the storms. Down there, the storms already repel machines so there won't be another army for him to call on nearby. Tuovilis's abilities to go through walls and attack from oblique angles is also nullified, since there are little walls. You've got experience in that strata? Kedra asked. He shook his head. No. Not that particular one. Though the info package Zong left behind explained the basics. It should do. That's if we find a storm before she finds you. And it doesn't answer what to do about said lady explosions. Cathida insisted. She's still going to have a clear line of sight from the roof of the world. Again, fish racks. Windrunner hummed. The Imperial Crusader is correct on that count. We can't pull this off with Tisefit alive. She needs to be killed first before we can descend down to the second strata, at the minimum. And there's no telling where she's holed up now. If we can find and eliminate her for good, it is a possibility to continue the operation. If we can't, we'll need to retreat and take a few years to find a Might Forge less defended, which probably won't happen in our lifetime. Tuovilis will be on the hunt as Keith said, so there may be exile in that future, to protect the clan from the fallout. Great. Win a stacked fight, or get exiled from my home right when it's become a fun place to hang out in. Lovely. I groaned. Or you could just give the silver bimbo to someone else. The Indicator Mortis would probably help out. They won't be happy about it, much like me, but they would understand duty comes first. Leave the broken feather to them and they'll handle it. Surface clans generally are alone, but in this case we could rely on the Undersiders to help. Windrunner said. Events here are bigger than any of us. Though, part of me rankles at the thought of giving up. That's not the way of the clan, and I'd have to live with that kind of shame hanging over my head. Cathida sighed. Am I seriously the only voice of reason here? Surface savages, the world doesn't always revolve around you. Mission's a bust, go and link up with the Imperial Order, and surrender to Wrath there. It's the only reasonable option. Join up with them if you want or go home and retire after, splash around in those baths of your and ogle a real rack. Either way, you live the good life instead of dying for nothing here. Windrunner turned. We're different from you, Crusader. There are causes worth dying for. This is one of them. Load of scrap shit. I'm dead in case you haven't noticed. Dead, dead. Cathida said, voice growing louder with each sentence. And guess how I died? It wasn't from alcoholism while relaxing on a beach chair like I'd hoped for, I'll tell you that. Talking to me about dying for a cause, of all people. What are you, in your 30s? Lecturing me? Get another 3 decades of service and maybe you'll finally develop some wrinkles where it counts, young ma. She shut down as I finished hitting the mute button. Windrunner tilted his head at me, looking more amused than anything. I shrugged back. Once you get her started, she doesn't really stop. Ever. We all turned to Kedra, waiting for her opinion as the tiebreaker. She hummed, thinking. We have a weapon that can kill a feather with us. We've got the skills to kill feathers as well. And there are feathers here. Ridding the world of suffocate would be the right thing to do. Even if we fail on all other counts, honor would have us at least try to make the best of the situation. If Kathita wasn't muted, I think she would have broken down right about now and gone into a frenzy. All right. Sounds like we're still in this. I said, thought under a different definition of success now. We'll need to fight suffocate before anything. Windrunner pointed out. No matter what we do, she has to die first. Talking about her, I think I have an idea on finding her hiding spot. Didn't think we'd use up this card this early, but got to work with what we have. I said. We'll need to bait her out. Windrunner and Kedra turned to me, waiting to see what I'd come up with. They weren't quite happy with it when I outlined my idea, but Kathita loved it, so I'm left with mixed feelings about how good the plan really is. Oi, asshole in the walls. I called out over the comms number Evelis had given us. Said asshole picked up immediately. Winterscar. If you are requesting a surrender, I am open to negotiating terms. Hell no, I'm calling to let you know we're about to blow up your whole plan. I said. I enjoy gloating before I win, see. I find it unlikely that you will see anything resembling victory. He cordially answered, unamused. Really now? The way I see it, I've got everything lined up already. We know you tossed the Might Forge into the next strata. We also saw your little choke points. They're cute, but you know it's not going to hold off the knights we brought. First strata machines melt like heated snow against regular knights, and you know I've brought more than just that. They're all on the level of deathless. Also, I know you have no idea where any of us are anymore. Must be really getting under your skin, eh? He stayed quiet for a moment, contemplating the response. Regardless of the situation, the Might Forge is out of your reach. This mission has no victory conditions for you or your team. There is no tangible target left. You remain here for nothing. You are risking lives for nothing. Not really nothing, but you're right, I can't win anymore and fix Wrath with the forge gone. If you understand, this task is no longer possible, accept a ceasefire and surrender Wrath. He said, pressing on the topic. She is nothing more than dead weight to you. Maybe if I were a cold calculator I'd agree. Ah, but see, here's the thing, Evelis. Humans don't operate rationally all the time. And I happen to be the world's greatest sore loser. So here's what I'm going to do instead, I'm changing my goal from fixing Wrath to lobbing your head off. And to Suffocate too for good measure, if she's listening in on the comms. She was on the channel, and answered, scoffing. Delusions now, human? I suppose I shouldn't have expected more from your kind. How unsightly. Your bravado does you little credit, human. Evelis said. We have all the time to safely eliminate all of you. This does not need to end in bloodshed. Surrender Wrath, she is the only one I care for. I can offer terms, Relinquished does not care about deals made with individual humans, you will die of old age long before it becomes a problem. Are you sure we can't just kill them? Suffocate asked, sounding genuinely put off. They're right here, crawling somewhere in the walls. It's not that I don't trust you'll carry out whatever terms you agree to, Evelis. I get a feeling you really are genuine with those, what's a few humans running off into the woods to you, after all? I wouldn't trust Suffocate with my pet rock, but she's not in change as I hear it. Problem we got is that I want you dead. Figure we might have a conflict of interest on that point. Time to roll for bluff, knock on metal it all works out. So, I've put explosives all over the choke points you've set up. Just wanted to call and hear your reaction. Not possible. Evelis said. It's not exactly hard to pinpoint all the best places for choke points. We have full maps of the temple from the Undercity. Did you think we couldn't spot the best ways to the center point from the very start? How else do you think we already know about the Might Forge being gone? I'm already here, Evelis. I've been here all along. And now, I'm going to wipe out whatever forces you have. Then, a dozen knights with fractal powers and night breakers are going to swarm all over your little trap and rip you apart limb from limb. Nice knowing you. Team, trigger explosives. And at that moment, there were explosions in the empty forge center room. I'd made my gamble. Father had once told me that all machines behave on patterns. If I could figure them out, I could turn anything into my advantage. Feathers weren't exceptions to that rule. Ivalice had one pattern I'd noticed. Something familiar. From the very start, he'd left comms behind so that there was always a possibility to end the fight diplomatically, the most non-destructive way to handle any conflict. In the tunnels he'd fought with hit-and-run tactics, and when the tables had begun to turn, he'd abandoned the attempts rather than take any more risks. Despite being a feather and having all the advantages, every movement and plan had been made to maximize gains while minimizing chances of defeat. Suffocate had always attacked from great range, and even been ordered to stand down early into a fight rather than to see it to the end. Even now, he'd picked up my comms and the first thing he'd tried to do was to get out of the fight and settle things. All of this led to one conclusion: Ivalice didn't want to die. And being left in the dark, while the enemy gloated about winning, was the last thing a survivor wanted to hear. I needed him as off balance as possible for what came next. Ivalice saw explosions as I'd said he would. They just didn't happen everywhere. Instead, only one tunnel saw explosives rip it apart. And from there, he heard a squawk of cries and curses on the comms. Journey and the other armors turned off the jammers the very same moment, allowing the transmission bugs attached to our armor to leak our position. A moment later, the armors resumed the jamming signals. But by then, it was far too late. All put together, Ivalice saw exactly what I hoped he would: a misfire. His enemy had made a mistake, and they had accidentally revealed themselves. And he wasn't the type to allow a mistake to pass by unpunished. From her hiding spot on a distant balcony, behind hastily made rubble ruins, Suffocate opened fire under his orders. Directly where the signals were coming from. 24 beams of blue light speared through the hidden rubble, and dug right into the tunnels where we'd hid. Everything inside was obliterated with no resistance. And by everything, I mean the bits of discarded armor plates we'd strategically left behind, where the transmission bugs had been latched onto. Leaving Suffocate's location clear and obvious while they thought we'd been killed. Found you! I hissed from the shadows, grinning wide, hands on my weapons with Windrunner next to me. Time we went and killed Feather number 2. Book 4, Chapter 35, Flight. I handed the clan lord my rifle. He took it with heavy hands, the armor clearly doing most of the work. We'd laid him out against a tunnel wall, somewhere a little higher ground. Water slapped against this armor's legs, doing nothing more than causing some more foam. Further ahead it fell down in a waterfall, joining the rest of the flood to the central whirlpool. During our scheming Atius seemed to gain lucidity again, no longer going in and out of a coma. Stabilizing. The deathless healing factor must be working overtime on his body, which was good news for us. Bad news was that it wasn't good enough to get him back on his feet, just awake and aware. From here, he had a good enough vantage point on the whole chamber, if he limped a bit into view. He wasn't supposed to get anywhere in sight for our plan, but Windrunner had made a good point about having last resort options available. Against a feather, our deathless wasn't in any shape to fight. But the rank-and-file machines were vulnerable to rifles, and those didn't need finesse or any kind of health to use. Point and shoot. A few extra dead machines was better than them running around for the rest of us. We planned to thin out the majority of the machines Ivalice could throw at us, but there's no way we could nail every crawling scraphead lurking about. The rest of the knights were waiting for the signal to storm in, hidden on the temple ground floor. They'd deal with the rest, as soon as we got the drop onto Suffocate. That was the one feather who had the ordnance to wipe out entire armies of knights if she landed a good hit. Haven't used one of these for some time now, lad. He coughed, hands still going through old motions to check over the weapon. The make and model was some undersider standard, but a rifle's a rifle. Windrunner knelt next to him. You shouldn't push yourself too hard, my lord. The Winterscar's plan has good chances of catching to Suffocate's location. I think we'll do fine if we get the drop on her first. Trust us. He watched Windrunner, staying quiet. Talking was still difficult for him. Black-red blood stained his grey short beard last I'd seen before we put a helmet on him. Breathing underwater wasn't something Deathless had powers for. Armor had no issue with something like that, however. He triggered the safety off and gave a nod. Go. Don't waste time. We went. The plan was pretty simple all put together. We'd snuck through the tunnel systems, spreading ourselves around the central room. Once we were all in position, I'd trigger one of our grenades and have the armors drop the jamming signal in the area. A neat pile of discarded relic plates had been left behind in another tunnel. Coincidentally, all these plates had the magnetized location bugs Ivalice had tried using. They were all still fully functional, so once the jamming dropped, Evelys would see their location. A bit of smack talk to make it look like we'd screwed up our grand plan, and a healthy amount of paranoid threat would have him shoot first, ask questions never. The real question in all this was wrath. We could leave her with Atias, though any focused machine assault would break through the single rifle we'd left him. And he wasn't running anywhere from his seat. We'd debated hiding Wrath somewhere, but that was also just as bad. If she got swiped, Tuovilus would call off everything and run with his winnings. He wasn't after us, he wanted Wrath. We were the annoyances in his way. So she stayed in the sack, tied up on my back. Safest place we had, and that wasn't saying much. The moment the jamming ended, Tisefit opened up on our decoys without any monologue or taunts, and the battle was on. I'd thought she might be hiding somewhere sneaky, like the very top of the tower here, or under the whirlpool somehow. Both locations where she could open fire anywhere in the area. Turns out, she'd been hiding behind a wall on one side of the area. Evelys must have decided putting her in more obvious spots would have been spotted, so he found another spot where she could rain fire on anything in the room. Closest to her was Captain Sagrius. Second closest was myself, and third would be Windrunner. Kedra ended up on exactly the wrong side of the location, which meant she was on Evelys duty, waiting for him to show up and respond as backup. Sagrius and I leaped out of our hiding spots, landing hard into the pool. This close to the edge, the water flow was fast but shallow, coming up halfway to our knees here. Far less than the tunnels easy enough to traverse in armor, likely deadly for anyone on foot. Our job was to keep Tisefit focused on us while the assassins in the walls snuck up behind on her. Tisefit was just as quick as we were, turning her fractals around and blasting away. Journey's HUD showed me firing lines where the occult plates were aimed at. It wasn't a singular line, more a cone of possible range based on prior combat log footage. So long as we were close enough and had visual contact with Tisefit, we'd know where she was aiming. That was going to be our main defense against her, along with Father's shoutouts over comms. Sagrius raised a rifle and opened fire. The bullets zipped past, not aimed at the feather herself but instead on her plates. That's our main weapon against her. Occult fractals were pattern-based, anything that disturbed the pattern in any way caused the whole thing to stop working. Bullet holes did a great job of that. And her plates weren't shielded. Likely she never expected to have to deal with soldiers getting this close to her. In seconds, running Father's combat engram, Sagrius had taken out 4 of her panels. The beam she'd sent my direction didn't get anywhere close to me, and a short juke to the side made sure she wouldn't land any other shots. The one sent to Sagrius forced the armor to come to a halt in order to survive the barrage as he rained bullet fire down. Windrunner was sprinting through tunnels, trying to eliminate any of the machine backup on the way. Kedra was doing the same on the other side, though she'd stay hidden in the darkness until Evelys showed his face. We were doing a great job as a distraction. Or rather, Sagrius was. Tisefit's eyes turned to the walking armor and fixated. You. Sagrius didn't answer. The engram running his motions didn't include any speech. Only destruction. He fired off more bullets, but the feather had fanned her plates to flow behind her, where she could protect them with her staff. The engram dropped the rifle, letting the straps hold it in place. A knife was drawn out in a signature halo flourish, ending in a reverse grip. Shoulders hunched, the charge continued. I also reoriented myself after that beam, having been forced to take a few steps too close to the edge, keeping a hand on my nightbreaker. Then realized belatedly that Tisefit hadn't missed her shot on me at all, she'd wanted me to jump closer to the edge. A giant metal bird emerged from under the whirlpool at the center of the room, water breaking apart into floating droplets as the metal wings expanded out before me, a talon reaching out. Not a bad place to hide that scrap head, come to think of it. Sensors couldn't punch through the water there, so of course Evelys abused that. In hindsight, I'm not sure why we were so convinced the bird was hiding somewhere topside looking to swoop down on someone. All of that passed through my head in a flash as I stood before the massive bird of prey with its metal feathers outstretched, water droplets flying everywhere. The next instant it had whisked me off my feet in one large talon, squeezing both Wrath and I up with it. There's where the plan goes to scrap shit. The momentum took us both into one of the walls, rocks breaking apart as the creature slammed me against everything. Journey's shields flared out, stopping most of the damage. Against a few thousand pounds of angry metal bird, the old wall wasn't enough to put a full stop to the speed. The rest of the machine sunk into the wall, force dispersing as the bird easily broke halfway into the wall in a cloud of kicked dust. Without stopping, it leaped off the rubble, high into the air, soaring away between the tower pillars with me in its grip. I got my senses back under control and tapped the mirror fractal. I'd been in vice grips before, FIDO learned it was a bad idea, and soon this bird was going to learn the same lesson. The moment the occult pulsed around me, the bird threw me straight up into the air and out of its talon, right as the wraiths manifested around me. A massive gust of wind flowed behind as it flapped its wings under me. I'd have thought simple wind wouldn't push an entire armor further into the air, and was proved horribly wrong. Further up I went, spinning into a chaotic tumble upside down against gravity. The soul trance kept my sight focused, though I could tell my body was getting incredibly disoriented. The further I retreated from my body, the more lucid things grew around me, and my mind grew more clear. Wrath straps were being put through the test, but so far they were holding. The acceleration up into the air was bleeding away as gravity finally took control again, so whatever it was that this glorified metal murder chicken was doing to the air, the effects were temporary. It's coming for another pass. Wrath sent out to me, violet eye open, locked on the bird even as we twisted around uncontrollably in the air. The metal beast flew right past me, massive wings beating against more than just the air. There was some kind of force it was pushing against in the occult sight, but I had no concept for it. I couldn't tell what it was. The metal feathers began to glow occult blue on their edges, and those I recognized immediately. Every single one of the shorter floating feathers were occult blades, while the larger ones handled the flight. It reached the apex of its ascent into the air, now far above me. The wings expanded majestically out, then clapped together with a resonating boom. 100 occult blades were sent soaring straight at my flailing body. If I had been a regular knight, I'd have been far too disoriented to notice what was going on, let alone mount any kind of defense from becoming a pincushion. I think even a deathless would have a difficult time surviving this kind of assault, unless they had the right spells to deal with it. But neither of those had the soul trance nor a paranoid amount of shield fractals inscribed on every angle of the armor. And I did. The blades flashed in my direction, 12 on an intercept course, while the rest would harmlessly fill the air around me. I didn't focus on anything else. In midair with no leverage, trying to move was a wasted effort. I put every bit of focus on the occult instead. 12 small occult domes appeared across my armor's glowing plate, and each expertly deflected off the machine's occult blade feathers. Blades struck against domed occult shields, and bounced off. There was nothing to hold the deadly edges against my defense to really test my limits. The damage was negligible to my sanity, it felt more like pulling against heavy weights attached all across my body for a half second. Difficult, but not impossible. So long as I didn't need to do this more than a few times. The massive enemy squawked in surprise, violet eyes narrowing as it folded wings around itself like a cloak and dove down, speeding past the fanning feather blades, and then flew in front of them. Right when its own fan of feathers would have struck the machine, the wings spread out once more, halting its speed. All the feathers shook in their flight, altering direction, chasing behind the bird instead. The bird's movements flowed like water, all those blades looking more like silver shimmering fish chasing after it, reattaching to its wings one at a time, from the closer ones to the stragglers. Minus the few blades I'd blocked earlier, those were spinning wildly out of control, down into the temple. Gravity finally took full control over me, and I began to fall down again. Except the bird took another swing at me, wings flashing blue, and the gust of wind following behind once more juggled me back into the air, far higher than before. Again, the bird's wings flowed blue and it zipped past me, attempting to skewer me a second time. Because if it didn't work the first time, try and try again until the squishy human finally dies. Need to come up with a plan against an enemy that clearly had experience fighting off deathless targets and relic knights. Constantly disorienting its prey, before eventually cracking their shell with hundreds of needle-like feathers. Being immune to standard rifles, all the bird had to do was keep its distance from any kind of occult blade the enemy had on hand. And the size of this thing, it would take more than one good stab to kill it. Throwing a perfectly timed knife at it wouldn't make the cut unless I got absurdly lucky. Given enough time, the bird would eventually break past my own defenses. I'd end up another number on the list of kills it had. My hand hovered over the Nightbreaker at my back, considering if I should use it this early into the fight. The bird didn't have any kind of defense that I could see besides speed and distance. If Nightbreaker rounds flew faster than it did, I could chop off a good amount of it. The cost would come down to an unrecoverable round. This far up in the air, anywhere I fired, the round would soar for a long distance and land anywhere into the temple. It'd be like trying to look for a needle in a snow pile. and I'd be down around against Tuvalis and to Sofit. Can't use the Nightbreaker here. Needed another plan. The main defense it had was distance and complete control over it. Speed let it run laps around me in the air, like a fish through water, and I somehow had to catch it or die trying. Come on, think. Can it move those occult blade feathers in different ways? I asked Wrath, sending the rough outline of my gamble. No. Those are magnetically locked into one orientation and a limited movement range. I could tell she approved of the idea, good thing too. There wasn't time to come up with a plan B. All right, here goes. A cold pulsed around me, and the mirror fractal flared up. I'd done this once before. I could do it again. Had to do it again. While I was getting juggled in the air, the rest of my team was fighting tooth and nail against Tuvalis and his forces. Time was ticking. The wraith appeared, emerging from my armor, arms healed glowing with deadly interlocked blades. Then it flew through the air, unfettered by gravity, directly at the machine bird. It gave another squawk, and wrapped its wings around itself, spinning back down as the wraith soared above it. The machine moved like a serpent through the air, seeking another point, giving quick beats of wings to maneuver around. I'd hoped the wraith was faster than it could be, but this several hundred-pound monster was moving through air like an acrobat. Outright creepy, since there's no way something this big could take turns in the air like that. Nailing it with my wraiths would have been extra. The main meat of my plan came down to something else. If I wanted to catch a wild fish, I'd need to hook the bastard. Falling straight down, spinning wildly, my free hand unlatched the grappling rope from my belt, taking hold of the loop with practiced hands, working as quickly as I could while keeping my focus on the occult. Again I sent a wraith to hound after it, mostly to buy myself more time. It again slipped away. At least my constant prodding with the wraiths had forced it to deal with those instead of trying to keep me helpless in the air. Slowly, I took command again of my chaotic tumbling. The turning and twisting ended, the hook and rope ready in my hand. Couldn't be spinning around aimlessly for this next part. The bird wasn't used to having to dodge and weave around an enemy throwing wraiths at it. Its movements were predictable. Kedra had done this kind of thing before. When she'd fought against Tuekar's ruined shell, she instantly spotted patterns of how it moved and then abused it. Once more, another wraith split from my armor and zipped after the bird, arm guard attached to the forearm, glowing bright occult blue. My hand lifted the hook up in a pitcher's pose, Journey's HUD lit up, trajectory set. A firing line appearing. I lobbed the hook as if I were throwing a hanger ball, launching it with relic-powered speed. The metal soared through the air, whistling with fury. The metal monster dodged the wraith I'd sent and squawked as my metal hook nailed it. Sleek as the bird looked, the mass of floating long flight feathers it had across its body made for hundreds of open spots for a thrown hook to slip in and hold fast. The hook blessedly did exactly that. Rope went taut and the game was on. The monster screeched in pure hatred as I flew right behind the bird. It stormed around the air, banking hard again and again to throw me off. One grab after another, I began to close the distance to the monster, crawling up the line. Journey's grip on the rope was unyielding. "Come here, you piece of scrap," I snarled, launching wraiths to keep it on the defensive, and away from the rope. The more time it spent trying to avoid the wraiths, the less time it had to figure out how to cut me free. These were manufactured to hold a relic armor's weight several times over, only an occult blade could cut them. That said, all the turns and twists were going way over what the rope makers had ever thought these would go through. Damage was accumulating, with multiple sections of the rope starting to fray. Journey kept track of the weak parts, highlighting them, estimating when the breaking point would be reached. It also estimated the time I'd need to reach the monster at my current pace, and luck was on my side for the first time. The bird must have realized the same thing. I'd reach it long before the rope would snap. Panic started to take over the movements. It twisted in the air, and began a mad sprint to the main tower. It was pretty obvious to me what the god's damned bastard planned to do. I cursed every swear word I'd ever known, including some Cathita had taught me, all the while wrapping one hand awkwardly around my back to hold Wrath's sack as close as possible, locking the arm. I braced as best I could for impact, my other hand tugging hard against the rope, looping it around the back of my palm in a quick motion, trying to stack the odds against what would happen next. The machine rocketed straight at the tower, and banked away at the last second, catapulting me into the tower wall like I was the mace end of a spiked chain. Journey's shields flared up as rock broke around me, orange lit up my medical scans, even as I could see the internal organs inside me take the blunt force. Human bodies were not made to withstand going from recklessly fast to completely still in half a second. The rope wiggled and coiled in the air, then grew taut again as the bird raced away, still holding together in one piece. And from the cloud of pulverized tower rock, I emerged, still moving up the rope, one hand grab after another. If it wasn't terrified before, now it certainly was. I was a minute away from getting my foot on solid ground and taking revenge. The wraiths flying at it like bullets kept it from slowing down to bite the rope or slice it apart. The occult feathers it had were worthless, all in the wrong area and unable to be moved individually around. Wrath's judgments were on point. The bird had all the tools it needed to cut me free, and no chance to make use of anything. And soon it didn't matter as my boot connected with the creature's back despite its best attempts otherwise. My hand snaked from the rope down to grab hold of its back. It tried to go into a barrel roll, hoping to knock me loose or at least disorient me further, but Journey had held tight against a rope this whole time. Now that it had even better grip and traction, the bird could do whatever it wanted. I wasn't going to get knocked off. Wrong move. I hissed and drew out my occult fencing foil. The grisly work of stabbing away at its back began, slashing the bending sword through expensive-looking parts again and again. In the throes of death, the machine tried to run back to its master, maybe hoping she'd shoot me off. And all the while I advanced up its back, getting closer to the neck one step at a time, stabbing down at every free moment I had. The bird screeched, violet light flickering on the chassis with each stab into the body. The wings grew more rigid, until I hit something critical and they outright stopped, stretched out and let the monster glide, directly on a collision course to the central tower. Gone were the aerial acrobatics, the fluid motions. Black oil poured out of multiple deep wounds I'd given it on my single-minded climb to the head. At this rate, it would crash into the side of the tower. A stab deep into the spine at the base of its neck caused the entire monster to seize up with one last shriek of anger. I leaped forward, hand reaching out to grab the side of the immobile head, feet swinging down against the beak for stability. Relic helmet caught the seething stare of violet eyes, the apertures within the cameras deep inside narrowing down to focus on me. My blade reached back and speared straight through, down to the hilt. All lights on the monster instantly went dark. One down. Now for the rest of them. Book 4, Chapter 36, Interlude I, Windrunner. Windrunner's only job was to get closer to Tisefit while she engaged Keith and Sagrius, and jump her. Short simple plan that left him a lot of room to improvise as the situation changed. If he could tie her down that was good enough. If he could kill her, even better. He'd gotten some info on her weaknesses, and what he could expect fighting against her. Enough to work with. It suited him just fine. He'd earned his rank by skill, tactics wasn't his domain. Ironreach was far more inventive when it came to those, despite the rank differences. It was ironic in a way. That asshole constantly joked around about getting off on a mission right before proposing to his would-be wife. Always claiming that it was his good luck charm, by taunting the gods ahead of time. Seems the gods were having a good laugh about it in the end. Windrunner was the one stuck in a mission that had more Relic Knight fatalities than any in clan history, including Lord Atius being crippled to a level he'd never seen before. While Ironreach was likely away back home enjoying a bath, or happily breaking raider skulls. He put the thoughts out of his mind as his feet moved across the shallows. On the other side of the chamber, Kedra would be doing the same, racing through the dark tunnels, eliminating anything in her path. The tunnels were somewhat well mapped by now, they'd taken their time to organize the ambush. And so he knew where the machines had built up their choke points. Those needed to be destroyed, so that when the rest of the knights arrived, they'd be able to jump directly into the fight instead of dealing with an entrenched perimeter guard. The machines didn't see him coming, not in this darkness. They were shuffling around instead, reorienting in order to go out and assist against the two exposed knights fighting off to Tisefit. Unable to see him coming, and caught out of position, Windrunner hit their group like a sledgehammer at just the wrong angle for them to fight back. His swords lit up and bit through arms and legs alike, crippling some, killing others. A group of 10 screamers were all downed in seconds. Windrunner was nothing more than a bright glow of blades flashing through the darkness, before winking out of existence as the night passed through. The machines would be aware of their presence now, but that advantage would be negligible at this point. The Winter Blossom technique let him move to absurd speeds, although he did avoid being too entranced inside. Past a certain point, physical sight vanished and only the occult sight remained. Practical as it was, Windrunner still needed to see important information on his helmet's HUD. Like video footage of Sagrius and Keith's actions. He'd been halfway to Tessefit's location when Keith was abducted by her metal bird. A moment after, Keith's camera feed turned into blurry pixels, then winked out, too far out of range. No time to think about that, the kid would handle it. Windrunner had one job and would stick with it. He had to trust his team to be able to complete their objective. Zagreus wasn't having it any easier, alone against Tessefit. He watched the events on his HUD as he broke through another scrambling choke point of machines, butchering the enemy reinforcements without pause. The captain's camera spared no detail. Tessefit pointed her staff directly at his face. 3 beams shot in a pattern, made to force the captain down a single path. The armor followed through, leaping above the final beam. She jabbed her staff once more in his direction with a leer. Beams erupted around her, diving straight for the airborne knight. Zagreus made no change in direction, nor even an attempt to twist in the air. Instead, fractals over his armor glowed bright occult blue, and multiple domes came to life around the armor. He vanished in the destruction, the camera feed showing only bright white before they winked out into dark, the signal cut. Tessefit laughed as the beams continued. Windrunner could hear it echo even inside the tunnels he scrambled through. Luck doesn't favor fools, Chui. Her beams had ended. The camera feed picked right back up. Captain Zagreus emerged from the destruction. Unharmed. Blades glowing, seeking retribution, landing into the water and springing back up. Even his relic armor shields hadn't been triggered, still showing next to full. The feather shut her mouth and opened fire again, eyes focused. A mass amount of beams in all directions this time. The captain leaped across the distance, dodging what he could, and outright taking the hits where he couldn't. The occult dome shields never wavered, more springing around him, cycling through. Water slammed into him from all sides, the flow turned into chaos with all the beams sinking through in explosive steam. How? Tessefit screeched, taking a step back, staff pointed uselessly to the approaching knight. A part of Windrunner also agreed with Tessefit's outburst. How the captain was outright taking her hits head-on and surviving past it was a mystery to him. He wasn't going to abort his plan, however, even if it looked like Zagreus now hard-countered the enemy. Anything could happen. He had to make his way through the tunnels, and jump Tessefit. If she was killed earlier, all the better. If not, that's what he was for. All the while the captain continued his relentless approach, climbing out of the water and onto a stairway leading to her position, sprinting at full speed. The feather's eyes narrowed with hatred. All 24 panels paused in their movements, focused on the rushing knight, and opened fire. The armor stopped the charge for the first time, hunching down on itself, one knee on the ground, bracing for impact. Occult shields appeared around and nearly 24 blue beams once more consumed the captain whole, the rest fanning out to catch anywhere he might have chosen to dodge. Windrunner gritted his teeth, watching. Destruction rained across the water, turning most of the room into a misty hellscape. From the fog, an occult halo traced out a knife again, long sword at the other side. He still wasn't dead. Gods above, whatever the kid did to get the armor moving around, it was paying off 100-fold. Zagreus had turned into a monster of his own. Tessefit took another step back, shock in her features. She pointed her staff once again at the knight, then slowly lowered it back down into a balanced fighting position, resigned to the inevitable. Her beams must either be on a cooldown of some kind, or she wasn't going to bother trying to shoot down the indestructible captain. Zagreus clearly saw no issue with that, leaping right for her, blades seeking out targets. A moment later, he was forced to curl up in defense against the end of a chain swinging straight for him. It cracked against an occult dome, dealing no damage, up until the end of the whip exploded with a pulse of occult, sending the knight spinning away, directly into the whirlpool at the center of the room. Windrunner cursed to himself, watching as the captain's video feed promptly scrambled into static, turning black as the armor lost signal, the knight falling down through the whirlpool, into the second strata. Tuovilus stepped out of a wall, recalling his chain back to the hilt. I ordered you to retreat. He hissed at his companion. Tessefit glared back at him, head held high. I could have handled it. And I don't need my ordnance for a simple human, nor your meddling. Debate that later. We have 2 unknowns approaching through the tunnels. Tuovilus answered, eyes turning at one of the tunnel entrances. Windrunner raced through into the light a moment later, landing on open ground and following through with his momentum. He'd sheathed both blades in preparation for the sprint across the open ground. This was as close as Windrunner could get with the tunnels as a line-of-sight breaker. He had to survive the dash forward until he was in melee range. He leaped straight out of the dark hidden pathways, into the open air and down into the water. Tuovilus being here complicated things, the chain had far larger reach than it appeared. Still, he didn't change his focus, kill Tisefit or keep her occupied long enough. Leave Tuovilus to Kedra, that was her duty. He could see her video footage, the girl was keeping pace. His hand reached to his back, taking out the underside rifle as his armor, turning the safety on as he raced across the ground, ignoring Tuovilus and focusing only on Tisefit. The other feather began to spin the chain around, only to dodge backwards as an occult knife zipped through the air and sank into the wall behind. Kedra leaped down, 2 long swords drawn out. She didn't say anything, instead rushed straight against Tuovilus. "I'll handle the Winterscar," the feather said, "take on the other knight. Don't take shortcuts." Both eliminated every choke point from the north side up for a reason. Tisefit huffed, "It's only 2 humans. We're feathers. You worry too much." A cold plate spun around to turn on the clan knight. The knight gritted his teeth, accelerating his pace, taking aim with his rifle. So far this was still going according to plan, minus Tuovilus being already out on the field. But Kedra had made good time on her end, so that part was negated. The feather pointed her staff in his direction. Chills spread through his body, knowing the destruction that would follow. Windrunner zoomed in his targeting sights, HUD expanding the picture ahead, helping him search. He kept his rifle aimed forward. He couldn't afford to miss here, there'd be no time to reload another magazine. Tisefit could either protect her plates from bullet fire, but be unable to shoot with them, or shoot at him and take the chance of losing plates. The threat of his rifle clearly wasn't enough for Tisefit to pick the safer option. 3 plates glowed blue, portals appearing on the surface. His finger pulled the trigger down, sending a controlled burst of bullets at each. 2 were nicked, the occult instantly winking out as the bullets disrupted the patterns. He didn't get to the 3rd in time. A blue beam lanced out, forcing him to leap to the side, sliding hard against the water floor, sending a massive splash to the side. His rifle never left the target, nor did he slow down his speed. Tisefit tugged, black mist flowing out of her dress, reaching for the damaged plates. "It's useless, you know. I can repair any faster than you can break them. And I have so many spares to use." 5 more plates glowed. Windrunner was prepared, opening fire and catching 3 as he sprinted out of the falling water. The other 2 got their shots off on him. The first speared past his chest, inches away thanks to his last-second dodge. Shockwave expanding out, forcing his armor's shields to trigger. It knocked him off course, causing him to spin to keep the momentum going. The other beam speared right for him. No options now. Atius could do it, and so had Sagrius. Hand extended out, he took his chances with the occult dome shield fractals, powering the spell. The shield responded to his will and took on the beam near head-on. The moment it collided, Windrunner realized he was no Lord Atius, a deathless with centuries of practice, able to hold off her beams a dozen times in a row. Nor was he the Winterscar captain, turned into something other, in exchange for the power he needed. The weight of the occult spell felt like moving a mountain, an utterly impossible task. He abandoned the idea of being able to hold off the beam, instead, he twirled on his side, using the shield to buy him the precious half-second he needed to get just out of the kill zone. His relic armor's regular shields took on the blunt of the shockwave following through, sending him off his feet and crashing into the water. He rolled, drew his rifle back up and opened fire near blindly, continuing his sprint forward. His gut was on point, 3 of the plates were already about to burn him out of existence. He got all 3 with the full auto, along with 5 other plates before his rifle clicked empty. Damn! He'd lost this rifle earlier than the plan outlined for. He tossed the spent weapon away, drawing out swords, accelerating the last few feet of distance. It wasn't going to be enough. The feather simply drew on her unused plates, another 3 glowing blue. He'd need to be very quick with the dodges to get through this. The HUD highlighted possible areas of danger, and it was easier to pick out the spots that might be safe compared to everywhere else that absolutely wasn't. He wasn't going to make it past her cordon in time, one of those beams would hit him. Rifle shots came from above, sinking into the 3 glowing plates, taking them out of the picture. "Give her hell, lad." Atius weakly spoke over the comms, aiming down from his seated position, rifle held steady only by the strength of his plate. Windrunner felt a flush of shame go through him. Having the clan lord cover his back was considered the very last resort they'd planned for. Position revealed, it was only a matter of time until the machines came for the crippled Deathless now, and none of the knights were going to be able to keep him protected. Atius had just traded his life. It paid off, however. The knight leaped into melee range, blades lit up. Tisefit sighed, shaking her head as her staff twisted into position. You humans never learn. Ranged, melee, it's all the same chances. You'll die and I'll win. Less talk, more slicing. He said, and dove into the fight. Windrunner was finally in his element again. Close quarters combat. Among the clan, he'd been chosen as a bodyguard to the clan lord himself for a reason. Tenny-cent Winterscar might have surpassed all of them, but that man was an exception to the rule. Windrunner could handle any other relic knight from the clans and win. Tisefit was a challenge on another league. Within the first few jabs and slashes between the two, Windrunner realized the difference in levels between them. She moved too fast, the staff a near blur in the air, keeping up with his own strikes and throwing out her own in quick succession, rapidly eating through the rest of his shields. That was fine. There were other ways to win against a superior opponent. Tisefit may surpass him in every metric, but if she made a single predictable move he was already prepared for, it wouldn't matter if she was better everywhere else, his blades would still sink into her throat. And there was one move she'd shown to perform before, the moment she was caught in close quarters. He just needed to give her a good chance to use it, and survive long enough to see it. Another set of jabs and parries left her in a perfect position for a uppercut swing, which she took without hesitation, a cold pulsing around her. Rock and water flowed behind her staff, uprooted by the force following behind. Windrunner didn't wait for the strike to land. Nor did he try to defend himself. This was the window he'd been waiting for. He leaped directly forward, arms opened wide. If he couldn't beat her with swordsmanship, he'd drag her down into the mud instead. Nobody could parry a blade while having their arms locked up in a vice. So long as Kedra kept Evelus too occupied to rip him off, there was a chance of victory. It worked, somehow. The sheer shock of having a human try to grapple a feather seemed all the time he needed to wrap an arm around her, tackling the feather down into the water. One way or another, he was going to kill Tisefit. And if he had to do it with his own fists instead of a blade, by the gods he would. Book 4, Chapter 37, Interlude 2, Windrunner. They both tumbled into the rock and ruins, her oversized hat falling off into the water. A relic-powered elbow slammed into her head, knocking her back down as she tried to stand up. A knee into her stomach folded her up, and Windrunner snaked around with a practiced grapple. He wasn't sure if a chokehold would have any traditional effect on a feather, but he didn't have the time to come up with something new and untested. The position still gave him leverage and that's all he needed. His blades were in an awkward pose, unusable. Too late to fix it now. He had other options available. You dare? Tisefit hissed, who do you think you are? A foot slammed into the back of her leg, directly on the joint, forcing her down on a knee. He went right to work, pulling against her neck, aiming to rip it clean off. Against a human, it would have been like snapping thin ice. Against another knight, it would have taken a few seconds for the helmet seals to fail against two arms prying it off. Against a feather, the armor strained, mechanical whirling sounding across the chest and arms. Synthetic muscles began snapping away internally, sounding like deep clicks rattling within his armor. White elastic skin started to stretch across Tisefit's neck, growing taut, but the internal spine refused to break or buckle under the force. Windrunner tried harder, putting his full body to work. Red warnings began to flash on his HUD, showing cascading damage. Tisefit gave a snarl, eyes widening, realizing what the human was doing. She dropped her staff and gripped his arms with both her white porcelain hands. The slender digits clenched and his armor dented under each finger. That wasn't supposed to happen. The red warning messages continued to populate his HUD, more and more parts of his armor breaking down against the might of a feather. She pried, slowly peeling off his wrapped arms from their chokehold. Tension left her neck. This wasn't working. New plan. He twisted on himself, taking her off her feet with him, slamming the feather into the ground. It did next to nothing against the monster. He put his full knee on her back and strained with his armor, pulling against her neck with everything he had, but those hands of hers still held off his arms and took the entire force his armor could generate. The right arm buckled, failing outright, power going out as the dented metal cut into the remaining fibers. Instantly he triggered the emergency release, letting the isolated arm plating collapse into smaller pieces with micro-explosions across the chassis, freeing his actual arm. With that, his true hand dove for the spare dagger at his chest. The cold hilt hummed in his hands as the weapon lit to life. Without wasting a moment, he flipped the dagger into a reverse grip and sunk it directly into Tisefit's stomach. Her personal shields lit up at the last moment, blocking the blow. He dug against it regardless, trying to get past the wall he'd run into, grinding his teeth together with effort. Shields couldn't last long against an occult edge, seconds at most. He just needed to keep going. Just a little bit more. A soft hand wrapped around his own and squeezed. Having stepped out of the soul trance in order to move his arm, Windrunner felt the pain of his bones and fingers break, squashed against the hilt of the blade, pulverized into shards. He gave a muffled scream, gritting his teeth through the pain. Blood and cartilage was squeezed out in between her fingers, staining Tisefit's robes with scarlet splatter, dripping down the occult dagger, leaving the mangled remains of his hand a mess of crushed muscle. She rose on her feet, lifting him up with her. Her other hand still prying apart the last of his hold. Inevitable. Tisefit calmly levered the weapon off her stomach, overpowering him as if he were nothing more than a child against an adult. He didn't let himself panic. His right arm might be caught in her vice grip, but he still had the other one. He needed to get free first. Windrunner, break her hold. Leave me the sword. He ordered the armor, trying to keep his voice level against the waves of pain coming from the hand. The armor complied, breaking apart the sections caught by Tisefit's other hand. She was left holding nothing but dented plates, as the armor shrugged off the modular parts, shutting down power to the armored hand. The hand was heavy. Extremely heavy, but Windrunner didn't have a choice. The long sword rose and dove straight down, cutting his right hand free from the dagger and Tisefit's grip. She seemed almost surprised. He twisted on himself, and slashing forward with the longsword, hoping the momentum of his twist made his movement fast enough. It hadn't. She slapped the flat of the blade out of the way, and jabbed her hand forward directly at his chest plate. The remnants of his armor's shields flared up and took the blunt of the force as he took a step back to keep his footing. Tisefit didn't stop. She stabbed again and again with nothing more than her bare hands. Windrunner swung his blade down like a sledgehammer, only to find the attack halted. She'd grabbed his wrist. A cruel smile curled on her lips. She began to pummel his armor, throwing crushing punch after punch that the armor desperately repelled with its shield. One chop on his exposed arm had broken the bones there, making the whole thing go limp. A final attack had her hand spear through his leg plate, the shield finally collapsing against the raw power. Her hand broke through metal, skin, muscle, and bone as if everything was nothing more than paper. He fumbled onto his knee, the armor's power no longer working on that leg and the pain shocking him even through the adrenaline. She finally let go of his hand, letting it flop down to his side. He looked back up, just in time to see her backhanded slap land on his chest. As if she were swatting away a fly. Dazed, he found himself crashed into a wall on the far end of the chamber. My, that was rather exciting. I haven't had that happen before. No Deathless was ever bold enough. Tisefit said, brushing her hand free of dirt and contamination, flicking her white hair back over her shoulders. Tuovilus was right in a way, you humans really are something different. Is it your diet, or did they put something in your water source? Windrunner considered his options. His right arm was missing a hand, the clean occult slice now pooling his blood out into the river, plus most of the bone were broken and the muscles pulverized. The leg was also bleeding out, but that part was being tended to by his armor's medical foam. The hand to be handled first. Hud gave him a few more seconds before the loss of blood pressure would cause him to fall unconscious. He raised a trembling left hand. Stripped of most plates, the raw synthetic muscle fibers showed all across the forearm. Most were frayed, unresponsive. The few that did work weren't doing much of anything to help him move. That was fine. The fractals on his palm were still there, and that's all he needed. He tapped into the fractal of heat, the very same one Master Keith had shown off as a demonstration all that time ago. With that, he lowered his missing hand into the flame, letting the skin burn and cauterize. It would buy him some time. And what exactly did you plan to do next, I wonder? Tisefit asked, reaching down for her discarded staff. Kicking his bloody cut-off hand along the way, the dagger spinning out of the crushed grip. You should have let yourself bleed out, less painful to die unconscious I hear. Windrunner turned to check in on Kedra. The girl was still neck to neck against Tuovilus, the feather fighting her off carefully, as if handling a wild beast. The young Winterscar was a brilliant fighter, but Windrunner could tell she wasn't going to win. Machines were now starting to pile out of the ruins, surrounding the pair. None of the machines made a move to attack, likely waiting for the right moment. Tuovilus continued his probing strikes, meticulously studying the human girl for easy wins. At least she was in better shape than he was for now, 3 gods granting small blessings. Rifle shots sounded further up, where Atius was positioned. Windrunner could see from the camera feed that machines were coming from the tunnels out for the clan lord. The rifle would keep them off him for only so long. And the last 2 Winterscar's camera feeds were black, a red no signal flashing on each. One likely stranded on the second strata if he'd survived the fall in the first place, and the other dealing with a massive metal bird. It wasn't looking good. Tisefit's staff once more raised up. The plates around her fully repaired. "Last words, human?" she asked. Windrunner's hand rose up, and he did his best to show her a finger. "I suppose you earned that one." She chuckled. "It was a good fight, and you've left me quite cross about losing my hat. Goodbye, human." 3 things happened in quick succession. First, he heard a metallic scream of pain and the tower shook, rock breaking apart again, collapsing. Something big had hit the side. Tisefit turned, eyes widening and then narrowing down in outright hate. "Oh, that nasty human. I'll tear him limb from limb for this," she hissed. Windrunner started to laugh, watching 2 video feeds reconnect. The gods really did provide. But it was the 3rd feed he was really paying attention to. An armored hand rose up in the video, a cold crackling around the plate, gaining in strength with each second until even the picture began to fuzz out and turn pitch black. Distant occult pulsed out, strong enough even Windrunner could feel it from here, and he'd never been gifted when it came to the occult secrets. The sense of something twisting, reality bending in ways it shouldn't. Powerful occult. It seemed to descend like an invisible veil around Tisefit, crackling pale blue lighting, forming around her like a thick mist, choking everything. Even water was pushed aside in a circle around her feet. "What is this?" she asked, the charged occult distorting her voice. She looked up and glared at him. "What are you doing?" Windrunner continued laughing. "Not me," he said, voice hoarse. 12 half-formed wraiths of the clan lord rose from the mist, like the dead returned for vengeance, surrounding the feather in every direction. Faceless helmets snapping up to gaze at their enemy. Blades flickered to life in the hands of each. They dove for her at the same time, leaping like demons from the old songs. She drew her staff up to defend herself. That was a mistake. The wraiths were never after her in the first place. Atius didn't order his army to fight the feather. Experience had shown that tactic to be ineffective. And Windrunner could see the way the wraiths moved, Atius wasn't all there either. He'd tapped the well too deep, the wraiths didn't carry any of the fluidity he'd seen used before. This was the very last scraps of whatever power he had left. Tisefit had too much shield still available, even if she somehow failed to dodge every strike sent. But the plates floating around her weren't as quick, nor as defended. The wraiths flowed around her, occult blades slashing out, wordlessly cutting her plates in half. The slices taking out whatever it was that kept them up in the air. They fell into the rushing water, swept down to the whirlpool at the center. Gone for good, falling off the edge into the second strata. Atius got to 17 plates before Tisefit swatted the last of the images, destroying each in quick succession with her staff tip. She screamed in rage the entire time her weapons were cut apart by the malformed wraiths. None of the images remained alive after her slaughter, the occult mist fading away around her. But 7 plates remained functioning when everything settled. The feather turned her gaze up to the tunnel where the deathless remained motionless, rifle at his lap. He raised a hand, slowly taking his helmet off, letting it slip down into the water around him, carried away to the waterfall, flowing to the ever-present whirlpool center. Hair matted down in sweat, eyes dilated, breathing heavy. There was no fight left in the old deathless. He didn't even have it in him to stand up. Still, he turned to face her with supreme effort, and gave one final blood-filled grin. Her staff lifted up, pointed directly at him. Blinding blue light struck. The walls and stonework crumbled apart, collapsing down. Tisefit gave a deranged scream, and opened fire 3 more times, eliminating everything in her path. On Windrunner's HUD, he saw Lord Atius's name wink out into grey. All that remained behind was melted rock, still glowing red. Windrunner hissed with pain, head rolling backwards, watching the sky, looking for where he knew the video feed was coming from. His eyes focused on the tower ceiling. The dead remains of a massive metal bird had crashed into it. And jumping off the back was none other than the Winterscar brat himself, a small red and silver figure, leaping from rock to rock. Sneaking by, looking for the right angle, before jumping directly into the air. A nightbreaker launcher in hand, aimed down as he fell. Directly at Suffocate. She didn't know yet. No one had noticed him. She'd been too furious, too focused on the clan lord's final moments. Windrunner turned back to Suffocate, watching 3 of her 7 plates begin to glow, staff raising up directly at him again. There was no hint of mercy on her face, only blind rage. He watched the other plates that floated behind. 4 had been used to kill the clan lord. Those were on cooldown, or she'd be using them right now. 3 were glowing, readying to fire. If he could survive 3 shots, she'd have no plates left when Keith landed. The kid would have a chance. He wouldn't be able to survive 3 blasts. He hardly was able to take on a single one. But he needed those 3 plates out of the fight somehow. "I'm going to erase you off the face of existence," she hissed. "Not even a scrap of your armor will be left behind. You can try." He croaked out. He couldn't move himself or wield his blade anymore. But he didn't need his body to do damage. The clan lord had showed him the way. His hands wrapped around the hilt of his old blade. The mirror fractal deep within his armor lit up. A mirror image appeared, unmoving within his body. He had to keep it hidden, she couldn't know until it was too late for her. "Come on, get your hand up," he thought to himself. "One more run. You are a knight retainer. Honor that vow, you stupid bastard. Get your hand up. Time is ticking." The hand lifted up, palm pointing at the feather before him. A cold pulsed across the hand, a dome appearing at the end, aimed opposite of Suffocate's staff. It seemed so small and fragile, up against a crushing might. Windrunner braced himself. "When sacrifice calls." Suffocate fired. "I shall gods damn answer it." The beam struck against his occult shield, and he felt the mountain weigh down on him with all its terrible weight. He held on, pain surging through his body and soul alike. At the same moment, his hidden occult image leapt to the side and sprinted forward. It wouldn't last more than 3 seconds, but neither would Suffocate's beam. He'd need to make do. A half-second passed, the wraith raced forward at the side of the beam, taking leaping bounds forward. Suffocate watched it, unable to move her staff without breaking her own protections against the shockwaves. Unable to fight off the approaching ghost. Violet eyes widening with the realization. The edges of his mind frayed apart, pain was all he knew as the weight bore down on him. The hand he held in front of him was nothing but fire and agony, skin peeling away in his mind until nothing but ash remained. The fractal glowing within burning at his very soul. The first glowing plate was sliced apart by his wraith. Suffocate screamed in anger, or so he thought. He wasn't sure anymore. All he heard was pain. Cracks appeared in the dome before him, spreading out like a spider web. The wraith turned its blade, and leaped for the second plate. Another second. The cracks spread, power seeping through. The fractal within consuming far more than the beam was. The cracks spread further, bouncing off each other, multiplying. Windrunner grinned. "Sorry, kid. Give her hell for me." The occult image's blade rose up to strike, then vanished before the blade could connect. Fading away into the air. Suffocate's beam burned through the wall unhindered, carving a hole of melted rock, and finally came to an end. And with it, so had the Relic Knight. Book 4, Chapter 38, The Bell Tower and the Feather. Environmental suits are sturdy things built to last against wear and tear. Tools and equipment help to extend the suit's lifetime with the tear part, but nothing's rated to be slammed against a stone wall while going at insane speeds on top of a dead metal bird the size of an airspeeder. Surviving a collision like that would have typically gone under the how to make peace with the gods sections of retainer training. No need to ask where the surviving part of that shows up, it doesn't. Fortunately, I was in relic armor, so the wall ahead of me was in more trouble than I was. The bird slammed into the top of the tower, breaking the already battered thing even further. Chunks of larger rock outright split up, collapsing down into the whirlpool at the bottom. A few pillars broke apart under the tower, but somehow the whole thing stayed together despite having a giant monster half buried inside. And holding on tightly for dear life on the more protected back of the bird was me. Alive. A novel way of defeating an aerial opponent. Wrath said. I will need to add rope on my list of potential threats to be aware of against future enemies. Never doubted for a moment, dearie. Young blood is exactly when heroics like this are supposed to happen. Cathita hummed in appreciation. What a grand show, right in its own home domain. Show's not over yet. I muttered, unwrapping my hands from the back of the metal chassis. For my next trick, I'm going to try to make 2 feathers disappear. Somehow. Squire shit. Go in with no mercy. Cathita corrected. You hesitate, you die. Great words of advice from someone who's dead. I said, climbing on top of the dead bird and making my way to my trusted hook. An inventory check was also running, looking over the list Journey had on my HUD. Wrath was still on my back, utility belt had everything from drugs down to grenades still there. At my hilt were my swords, and under Wrath's sack on my back, the white sheath of a special blade Lord Atius had entrusted to me. One I had kept hidden under sack and cape. Nightbreaker launcher was still on the small of my back, and a check over the weapon showed nothing serious had hit it. Maybe a few dents, but that's all cosmetic and adds character. I clicked it open, extracting the round inside to inspect for damages. Journey confirmed the integrity, sending an all clear before I slammed it back into the launcher, clicking the weapon shut. Given Evelus had a history of stealing my scrap, being paranoid of having my stuff stolen right off my back during a fight was fully justified. On afterthought, I clicked the safety off, priming the round ahead of time. I'd need it soon. Not exactly great trigger discipline. Cathita chimed in, as I retracted the hook and rounded up the rope. Against opponents that could move fast enough to fall under the dictionary definition of ridiculous, I want every millisecond I can get. Wrath tossed ice on that thought. The additional time would be negligible. We feathers can overclock our systems to calculate plans and process information at near any speed needed, so long as the heat draw does not pass certain thresholds. Hate to say this, but the silver bimbo's right on this one. In a fight with a feather, getting a few extra milliseconds of speed would amount to basically nothing. Don't fight your enemy where they're strong. A kick where the goddess won't look was often my first resort in bar fights. Worked back then, works just fine now. Point. I said, taking the advice and a few steps off the metal bird, jumping from cracked rock to rock on what was once a stairwell of some kind. I'll aim for a situation where all the speed in the world can't save them. Think that might be my only way through this. The stairwell did lead into the tower top, showing a smaller room all the way up here. Likely used to be a bell tower of some kind, but that bell was missing now, replaced by the dead head of my unorthodox ride back into the fight here. It remained dead, one of its eyes gouged out with a hole punched out on the other side. Also missing in the room was the floor. Crumbled away during the crash, showing a direct descent right down to the whirlpool at the bottom. And the events happening under me. Far below, on the perimeter of the whirlpool and solid ground, Windrunner was outright strangling to Sefit. I did a double take to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Nope. The man was holding the feather down on the ground, knee on her back, trying to rip her head clear off while she desperately tried to pry his arms off. She did not look happy in the slightest about these recent events. A mix between surprised, angry, and insulted. 3 gods on an airspeeder, is he actually going to win doing that? I whispered, in awe. No. Wrath said immediately. Human armor has a smaller max power range than any feather chassis, including older models. It is only a matter of time until Sefit overpowers the knight, even with his advantageous positioning. Better find a way down right now. Cathita said. Wrath's right, this isn't going to end well for him. He might hold her off for a few more seconds at best. And while she's held down, she can't dodge. I finished the thought, searching around the ruins of the room for any way down. If he could hold her still, I could end her. This was a bell tower, there had to be a way up here, unless the mites made the room for show. Which was possible, though this time luck was on my side. An archway on the other end of the room was half collapsed down, but it did show a further stairwell wrapping around the tower edges, going down. I jumped in one leap across the void below, landing on the overhang left behind by the floor, yanked a few rocks out of my way and raced down the stairwell. The rest of the internal was intact, up until I wrapped around where the bird had crashed above. That had a few chunks of rock crumbled down, obstructing the way. Journey calculated it could easily handle this much without issue. A few seconds into the work a massive occult pulse expanded from further down. The wave washed over me, unseen but absolutely felt. It felt eerily similar to the pulse that Father's armor had made when he'd forcibly manifested inside, taking command of the armor as a disembodied spirit. There's only one spellcaster in our party I could imagine being able to make such an impact on the occult. And it couldn't have come cheap. Not something like this. A moment later, my hunches were confirmed as Lord Atias's nameplate went grey on my HUD, following the sound of a screaming woman and her terrifying beams. She fired 4 times, one after another, clearly aiming to scour the deathless from the world, despite his name having gone grey after the first one. That's fine. I had to remind myself. Lord Atias was deathless. It's in the name. He'll be back. If anything, he might have seen it like a morbid shortcut to the surface, with the relic armor as payment. More importantly, if Tesefit was firing her weapon, it meant she'd shaken off Windrunner already. I yanked a larger chunk of rock out of the way, punched the remaining one in my way. Good enough, Wrath's sack was thrown through, landing on the other side with little decorum, leaving only her head poking out. She did not look amused with the treatment. With a heavy forward stomp on one more rock in the way, the crack was wide enough for me to fit through. Bits that were in the way weren't solid enough to stop a relic armor passing through. Part of Journey's white cape caught on something, but between several 100 pounds of relic armor and heavy unyielding might-made granite rock, the cloth may as well have been made of melting snow for all the resistance it put up. I hadn't even noticed it until I heard the sound of the rip, more concerned with making sure all my gear didn't get scuffed as I made my way through the obstruction. I grabbed Wrath off the ground in a drive-by, strapping her on my back as I raced across the stairwell. It finally led into open air, now following the massive pillars keeping the whole tower up. Chunks of rocks had been ripped off quite a few by now, showing hints of a metal skeleton under it. A nice, sensible touch from the mites to reinforce the granite holding several 100 tons this high in the air. What wasn't sensible was that the stairwell ended abruptly at one of the pillars, as if the way down was by doing a cliff dive. The mites really did make the bell tower room inaccessible to regular foot traffic. As if to add insult, parts of the stairwell were still there, hanging out like overhangs from the pillars, the middle section broken down with all the shaking, leaving only the sturdiest parts attached. Video feed returned from all parties left alive, and I cycled through each to check up the events. Kedra was locked in combat with what had to be Evelys, who used a chain weapon exactly as the rest of the approaching knights reported. He fought her carefully, letting the mass of machines surrounding the pair attack her one at a time, at just the wrong moments. They were used more like bullets in a rifle, carefully aimed and fired out without any thought of recovering them. It was highly effective. They died against her blades with hardly any spared attention from my sister, but that wasn't the point. Each time she was forced to twist around and cut down an encroaching machine, Evelys was mid-swing with his weapon, landing either occult blasts that she barely managed to hold ground against or outright chain strikes, which she used her dagger and occult shield to parry off. Each time the defense was costing her precious bits of focus. Regular shields had long since been burned out from the HUD display above her. Any hit could slice her in half if she didn't block it. Worse, each time those attacks came, there was absolutely no way for her to retaliate or turn it around. Evelys was playing a completely different game, leaving nothing to chance, turning a duel into a slow and certain execution. I jumped from broken ledge to ledge, cursing with every breath, trying to get closer to the ground before I had to jump this far down. As much as Cathida boasts about the old armor she now inhabits, relic armor wasn't miracle armor. Which is where I saw her earlier predictions on Windrunner had come true. The elite clan knight, with several decades of experience as a bodyguard for Lord Atias himself, hadn't been able to hold the ground against a feather by himself, although he'd gotten further than any regular human could have possibly been expected to. The medical report alone showed he wasn't going to make it back to the surface already without Wrath's full healing spell being used. On the other hand, Tesefit's plates had all vanished, except for 7 that floated closer to her person. As if she were guarding them like children. I cursed again, watching as he remained still against a cracked wall. The fight had gone out of the man the moment his cauterized hand slumped back down on the floor. His head lolled back, then turned ever so slightly in my direction. Even at this distance, with both of us carrying armored helmets that covered every detail of our features, I could almost feel his eyes locking onto me. There was only one thought going through my head. He had to hold on for a moment more, and I'd get to him. Windrunner seemed to understand, giving an almost unnoticeable nod. Then he turned his gaze back at Tesefit. A hand lifted off the ground, right before his executioner. The occult shield appeared before him. The time for thinking was over. Had to make do with this height and the tools I had on hand, or else I wouldn't reach him in time. Journey followed my commands without question, turning the careful jog into a full-on sprint before it leaped forward into the void, carrying me with it. I unhooked my nightbreaker and took aim as I fell. To suffocate fired. Windrunner took the blast, head on, dissipating energy washing off the sides, melting rock all around the night. His vitals instantly went to red, but they held. A mirror raced forward at the same time, leaping at Tesephate's remaining panels, slashing one outright, turning for another. I knew what had happened even before his name turned grey. The moment that image faded off from reality. A sinking feeling spread through my veins, as my slowed emotions caught up to what my rational mind had already figured out. Father had held on against the pull of the world, but only by sheer strength of will and a slowly chilling body to clutch onto until the occult gave him a backdoor into an occupied soul fractal. Windrunner had none of that. His body was utterly eradicated. And so were any soul fractals inscribed in his armor. There was nothing left behind where he'd been, besides melted rock. Shock came through me first, the propranolol tampering it down into more of a dissociated feeling of loss. Disbelief that I hadn't been able to save him, despite being seconds away. Incredulity that a knight and living legend like him could just disappear like that. I shoved it all to the side, focusing. Tesephat had to die. If there was anything I could do for Windrunner, she had to die fast. The targeting reticle on my HUD showed red as I locked onto her unsuspecting form. Just slightly behind her, from above. The perfect ambush angle. She snapped her gaze up, tilting her neck in the process, the halo above her sliding away. Wet hair matted her sides, violet eyes glowing with malice, with a truly horrifying grin spread wide. Directly at me. Surprise had been blown out the airlock. "Did you think I didn't notice a metal rat scurrying about in the attic?" she said, words floating through the comms while I fell, helpless to change course, her grin deepening until it looked more fitting on a monster, eyes narrowing like a predator. The staff in her hand raising up to aim at me. "I thank you kindly for delivering my rebellious little sister directly to my care. But I'll take it from here, human. I'm afraid that you are no longer needed." Book 4, Chapter 39, Oblivion. Of course, a relic armor falling straight down would have been spotted by a dozen of her minions. Or my launcher locking onto her silhouette could have triggered some kind of alarm in her systems. Maybe the sound of a several-ton bird slamming into the tower above raised some alarms. Dozens of possible ways she'd seen through me. All moot points, she'd spotted me somehow and played dumb because drama and feathers go hand in hand. Now my plan was rapidly coming down to picking the right prayer to make my peace in under 5 seconds. A shame since I wasn't terribly religious before, and it's worse now that I've met one of my gods. Never meet your heroes and all that. Feathers moved fast. I could open fire with my nightbreaker, but at this distance, I knew she had all the time in the world to take a calculated step out of the way the moment she saw my trigger finger twitch. The plate Windrunner had been about to cleave in half floated before her, turning to me, glowing bright blue. Journey's lock-on warning triggered, turning the HUD from orange to red. I wasn't going to beat Tesephat, I realized belatedly. Not by playing with the same rules she was. There wasn't beating her to the trigger pull, she'd win every time. I had to put her into a no-win situation, where all her speed and might couldn't save her. My head flashed through a dozen frantic calculations, racing ahead of me in ways I couldn't possibly explain, jumping between leaps of logic like a malfunctioning circuit board. Chaining further and further. The number of plates she had left. Why Windrunner had aimed for 2 specific plates instead of the other ones closer, given how little time he knew he had. The number of shots I'd heard her use against Atius. How the plate she'd used to kill Windrunner floated to her side with the rest of the other 4 plates, as if they needed a break before playtime. It all circled around my head, slamming against each other. A single conclusion came to my mind. One possible way to win. 3 gambles that all needed to be completely correct or I'd die. A wild leap of logic that my gut told me I was right to gamble on. What other choice did I have anyhow? Journey's HUD showed collision was imminent. Behind my belt, I yanked out one of my grenades, thumb already inputting the mechanical switches to the shortest possible time. Standard equipment for knights on expedition, 2 for each. Our team had been armed to the gills with equipment, I carried far more than just 2. One was all I'd need. It was tossed it straight down before me, thrown with every bit of power Journey had in its arm. By the time it would detonate, it would be right on her doorstep. Tesephat saw the grenade of course. Being a feather, she likely calculated the exact damage it could do to her, all within that very same moment, and found it to be next to nothing. Likely she didn't even need her personal shields to take a direct hit from that. If Windrunner couldn't rip her head off with his armor, putting every bit of power it had to the task, a diffused explosion would make her laugh. The plates that floated around her were a different story. Even if the blast didn't outright destroy those plates, they'd still get scattered across the chamber, far out of her control. Or a piece of shrapnel could cut a chip into the fractal, turning it off. Whatever happened, if the grenade landed, I'd wipe out what was left of her main weapon. Violet eyes locked onto me and narrowed. And her response confirmed my first leap of logic. She could open the portals within, but what was the trigger to open fire? And when? If the weapons discharged too early, they'd likely break the fragile fractal on their side before the portal was fully opened. So there had to be a delay to make sure the portals were fully set and open. If I was wrong, she'd have opened fire and melted the grenade from existence alongside myself, firing out faster than the half-second I'd set on the grenade. She hadn't. Instead, she pulled them to safety and under her occult shield, where they wouldn't be blasted away by my desperate grenade. But she couldn't open fire on me through her shield. So Tisefit's calculation had shown her she wouldn't be faster than whatever built-in delay she had. The grenade soared directly at her defended location, then exploded, fragments flying off in every direction. In open air, most of the force was swiftly expended, leaving behind smoke and embers of ash. I soared directly through, boots extended out, Nightbreaker still in reserve. Tisefit's eyes narrowed further, her grin twisting into a scowl, watching the Nightbreaker launcher for any sign I'd fire. Wrath had killed her last time with this weapon, she wasn't going to stand in the way a second time. If I fired point blank, she was going to see my finger press down on the trigger in slow motion, and this time she'd step away. My boots hit her occult shield with a thundering crash, the armor's knees folding down to absorb the shock, crackling occult licking the solace of my boots like a lightning globe. The feather glared at me from beyond the veil while the plates timidly returned back to their orbit now that the danger of the grenade had passed, Windrunner's final target glowing bright blue out of all 7 plates. Her eyes still weren't on me, only the launcher, the largest threat I had on hand. Which was exactly the distraction I needed. I rolled over her shield to dissipate the remainder of my impact, and turned the roll into a desperate horizontal leap, left hand reaching out, straight at the glowing plate twisting my way. A cold crackled on the weapon, the fractal glowing bright. Credit where credit is due, Tuvalis had it right, stealing your enemy's expensive stuff is a great idea. I'm sure he wouldn't mind if I took a page out of his book. She realized immediately what I was doing, the plate freezing in place before it began to reverse its path. But too slow. Far too slow. Tisefit could move at the ridiculous speeds feathers operate at. Her plates couldn't. I'd seen that firsthand. My free hand swiped across the air, fingers grabbing the backside of the panel, holding it tight. Tisefit screamed in fury as she watched me yank her plate straight out of the air, the weight of the relic armor from my leap easily overpowering whatever force the feather had that kept them moving around her. But my second gamble wasn't grabbing the plate. It was using it. Midair, turning desperately on myself, my soul reached a tendril out to the captured weapon in hand. I'd been able to touch all other fractals before so long as they were close enough. Why would this be an exception? It wasn't, and my second leap of logic clicked into place. My soul touched upon the fractal and sensed a response from within. I dove further in, searching desperately between the concepts it touched on, seeking to override Tisefit's control over it. One simple concept was what I looked for. Activate. Regardless of how complicated the portals were, there had to be something within that made it turn on and off. And deep within the fractal, I found that concept and forced it to turn on for me. It was trivial in the end, similar to warlock gear usable by anyone. No wonder she didn't have these connected to her soul fractal. They didn't need it. The portal appeared on the surface, as I aimed the plate directly back to its original master. Fear flickered through those eyes, realizing that I was about to shoot her with her own weapon. With all the speed and grace of a feather, her staff and hand twisted down, aiming directly at me, a occult shield blooming to life before her. And that reaction answered my third and final gamble. My third leap of logic was all about how she triggered these cannons to fire. Did she send out a signal from herself, to travel however many 100 miles from her? Or did she rely on another portal within herself to send a signal through to open fire? All of which could open her up to someone scrambling that signal. Overriding it. Or perhaps the distance made her shot too slow. Or open fire too early. Too much could go wrong, and she could be anywhere in the world. Those cannons were likely unmoving. Tisefit wouldn't want to risk losing access to her greatest weapon if she had to fight in a location where the machine communication network was unreachable. So she'd rigged the cannons on the other side to open fire, automatically. Easiest solution. Even in a place where she had no signal, if the cannons were only set up to detect that the portal was fully ready and handled everything autonomously, she could fire regardless of what happened or what state she was in. A torrent of power exploded forth from my captured plate, nearly point-blank directly into her shield. The destruction was instant, power fighting against power. I felt no recoil, but could certainly feel my grip growing slack, the little bits of fingertips holding the edge of the plate flashing out with shields as Journey tried to save those from being melted off by sheer proximity to the beam. My legs and feet were also running the same gauntlet, Journey's shield straining against the power firing too close. I landed hard on my back, sliding against the rushing water, already offering just a slight amount of protection as it absorbed the ambient energy, turning into superheated steam. Water splashing in every direction behind me, the beam turning everything before me into melted rock. The place was already filled with a thick white fog from the earlier fire, this one turned the entire world into a white steam room. But I refused to miss the shot, keeping the firepower directly aimed at Tisefit's glowing outline, even with my HUD turning the world near pitch black to compensate against the beam. It's useless. Tisefit roared on the other end, voice clear inside my helmet. Did you think you could win with my own weapon? The sheer arrogance. Well, she was right on that count. Her shield had been specifically set up to resist the destructive power of her beams. Perhaps not tailored to taking a full shot directly in the face, but likely strong enough to do so anyhow just to be sure. Never the plan in the first place. I hissed under my breath. My right hand lifted forward, aiming the nightbreaker I'd held onto, parallel to the beam. And she couldn't see it, not through the blinding amount of power pouring out of the fractal. Journey's targeting reticle turned red as the weapon locked on while I slid further against the ground, left hand holding onto aimed destruction, right hand waiting in reserve for just the right moment. I opened fire exactly the same moment the beam ended. The round roared into life, sound hidden under the hissing steam. It soared right behind the trail of light left, a black bullet streaking through the thick mist, air displacing everything in a wide cone around it. Energy dissipated, revealing Tisefit standing regally behind her intact shield. Cracks had formed on the core, but it remained powered. Unyielding. Her eyes searched for me, but what she found instead was the nightbreaker round, cutting through the mist like a silent assassin, just at the threshold of her shield. Feather reaction speed was impressive. And even with all that speed, all Tisefit managed to do was widen her eyes in surprise. The round slammed into her shield and triggered, 4 pale blue arms stretching out wide, overshadowing her figure, tenderly wrapping around her failing defenses. Calculations passing through her mind at the speed of lighting. Watching as her shield broke apart into fragments of fading occult, the nightbreaker fully unleashed on an already weakened great shield, easily ripping through whatever defenses she had. Shock. Anger. Fury. Flickers of emotion lit across her features. And finally, amused surrender when she inevitably reached the same conclusion again and again, inescapable. She couldn't move all of her body in under a fraction of a second. Not in any way that mattered. Even feathers had limits. The round lanced her directly in the stomach, rocket propellant carrying her up and off her feet, the chains wrapping around her limp body, cutting right through her personal shield with little resistance before sinking teeth further into her shell. She vanished backwards into the mist, halo clattering with a wet splash into the river under along with her staff, splashing further away. My head collapsed back down in the water, leaving me motionless on my back. On Journey's HUD, I could still see grainy video footage of Kedra's own battle against Tuovilis. She hadn't lost yet, but neither had she won. Instead, the two came to a standstill at opposite ends, an unworded truce while both were recovering. Tuovilis must have run through his heating quota, though I couldn't see any of that haze of heated air above his head. Picture quality wasn't exactly high definition. My head slashed to the left, where I stared at the circular hole drilled into the side of a wall. Occult senses found nothing lingering there but melted rock, and metal. No soul. Yours carry you to safety, wherever you're going next. Go with peace. I whispered. I'll make sure the bards make a good song for you. Couldn't have killed her without you. Keith, you must get back up. Wrath whispered through the soul link. She's still a feather. We must verify she's incapacitated. Wrath was right. Had to verify the body was dead. And maybe I might even be lucky enough to stab her through her soul fractal. Elbows pushed me back on my feet with a low groan, water streaming down my armor. Then my boots took mechanical steps into the white mist, carrying the rest of me forward. Searching for the remnants of my enemy. She was exactly where I thought she'd be. Laying still on her back, water flowing over her body, distorting her figure. To suffocate. I took more steps forward, Journey's HUD analyzing my opponent, details becoming clearer. The Nightbreaker chains must have missed her face, but the same couldn't be said for the rest of her. Large parts of her shell were breaking apart, washing away with the stream. The feather made no movements, silently staring up into the mist above. Deep lacerations had cut into her stomach and ribs, the chains ripping apart all her insides even if most of her shell looked attached together. Green liquid flowed from her wounds, washed away into the river, glimmering with golden dust. Power cell fluid. The round that had caused her destruction was nowhere to be found, likely washed away down the whirlpool already. In this mist, I couldn't even see the whirlpool at all. She didn't move, but smiled instead, giving a low chuckle as I steadily approached her. Ah! What a bittersweet ending. Mist surrounded us, a suffocating cloud of white that hid everything around me. Inside, only she and I remained. Violet eyes flickered, then locked onto me just as I reached her side. Kill me early and he'll resume the fight. He's holding back on my request, and I'm paying quite a price for it. I could see on Kedra's video feed how she was breathing hard, the steady movement of her helmet with each breath. So that's why they'd gone into a standstill. Fine. If Tisefit was willing to let Kedra catch her breath, I wasn't going to say no. I'll buy whatever time she's willing to give. What do you want? I asked. Was this how Tuekar was killed? Tisefit asked, unmoving, eyes watching up as I loomed over her. That blade. The one you haven't drawn yet this whole time. Tuevalis was certain of it. And in hindsight, he was right about you being a genuine threat to my life. I'm somewhat inclined to believe his other claims now. My hand tossed the spent Nightbreaker launcher, letting it clatter into the water next to her. It was useless with the round gone. I reached for the hilt of a weapon given to me by a man who knew he couldn't use it anymore. Traded him a rifle for it even. I wondered if I'd be fast enough to skewer her soul fractal before she fled. End the truce early but take out a feather permanently. A good trade. Probably not possible. Even with the element of surprise, Atias hadn't been able to against Tuorda. Makes sense now, they knew to watch out for it from the start. So you did kill him then? You. A human. She said, watching as I drew the blade out. The cape that had once hidden it was ripped apart, but occult weapons were far more sturdy than cloth. You're awfully chatty for a destroyed feather. I said instead of giving her any kind of answer. How could I not be? I was beaten by a human. Do you know how often that happens? Never. Not until Tuekar. Suppose I understand now why Tuevalis was so frantic about having you put down with extreme caution. The fractal within the blade lit to life, far more dangerous than any I had been around. Tisefit's beams would break apart anything material. This blade would do more than that. You killed a friend of mine. I said, bringing the weapon tip at her throat. I'm here to finish what he started. And you stabbed my precious Zephyr to death. I've had it for decades now. Are we not even? She said, head lifted up, eyes locked on me. Not even in the slightest. She sighed, letting her head drop back down into the water with a small splash, eyes turning up to stare into the white mist beyond. I do regret having killed the other human in a fit of rage. Tisefit said. It's only now that I can do nothing but think and wait that I find myself calm again. I should have turned him into a disciple for myself in hindsight. He was too talented to simply kill off over petty anger. A net loss. He'd have never joined your cause. Not in a million years. I said. And neither would any of us. And you would adhere to what cause instead? You won't win in the end, you must know that. Tisefit huffed, eyes turning back to the tip of the blade. Watching it as if it were an interesting market trinket, despite the weapon being inches away from where her fractals hummed. Relinquished can't be beaten, and she won't suffer a human to live that defeats feathers. Your friend was already doomed the moment he survived longer than a minute against me. You realize you're far too dangerous to be left alive now as well, right? Not the first time I've heard someone say that to my face. I said. And a little late to figure that part out. Maybe don't underestimate humanity next time. Humanity? That's certainly not what won you this battle. It's you, not the fleshy coffin of your mortal coil. Why you feel any amount of pride behind meat, I've yet to understand. But I could shield you from Mother, and your own mortality. You could become a chosen, a disciple under my banner. Perhaps even a feather yourself in time. It's the only way a human could live in a world controlled by Mother. Wrath hissed across the channel. If you want a human, go find another. He's already mine. Suffocate laughed. I suppose you did tell me once already. I didn't pay it too much attention, but now I think I understand. Wherever did you ever find humans like this, little sister? She picked a fight with me, and I won. I said. This is a highly simplified version of events. Wrath corrected. Fine, I slammed a door in her face and cut off her leg the first time we met, after I shot her a few times too. Now we're good friends. You know, usual way you meet friends. Suffocate closed her eyes, shaking her head wistfully in the streaming water. You truly are wasted under a doomed cause, human. Such a shame, but there will be time again in the future if you don't die today. There won't be. Relinquished and machines like you won't stop until all intelligent life is dead. Not a great cause to follow. An over-exaggerating. Humans are hardly the only ones that matter. I watched her silently, an unworded question hanging in the air. She scoffed, must I spell it out for you? Life still exists. Trees still grow, animals roam around, and mites plant their seeds undisturbed by Mother in every layer. 12 miles above the ground level is far more space than you can possibly imagine. Your kind has to pass on the torch to your descendants, you've clung to it for far too long now. There are plenty of creatures further underground just as intelligent. But go on then, cut off my head. The time I brokered with Tuvalis is coming to a close. I do hope you live long enough for a rematch. I would find it incredibly disappointing if you were to survive this far only to die to him. She didn't need to ask me a second time, giving a deeper satisfied smile instead. I stabbed the white blade forward, directly into her throat, right where her fractals were, a cult lighting up with that terrifying fractal, seeking complete and utter destruction. Of course, she fled long before the tip of my blade had even touched her skin. The blade cut through metal and nothing more. No occult pulse or soul-rending rib. But dead was still dead, and Suffocate wasn't going to come back anytime soon. One more down. I muttered to myself, watching the violet eyes dim. One left to go. Book 4, Chapter 40, The Final Feather. Not for the first time, my sense of planning and rationality shook hands with the petty thief inside in mutual agreement. Carrying around an orbital cannon the size of a small metal plate had a certain draw to it. Like explosions, and setting things that shouldn't be on fire, on fire. Unfortunately for me, the moment Suffocate faded away, a safeguard of some kind triggered over her plates, causing the internals to melt. Including the one in hand I'd used to kill her with. Maybe she manually triggered it herself in whatever purgatory feathers go to when they die, out of sheer spite. What other reason would she have to rob me of a weapon that could obliterate anything in my way? No other reason than petty hatred, and a deep desire to not share her toys. I'd need to kill Tuvalis the old-fashioned way, hitting him with another nightbreaker when he couldn't wiggle out of the way. And since mine was spent, I'd need to get Kedra to nail him. The fight between the two had resumed the moment Suffocate had given up the ghost. Tuvalis wasn't wasting a single second longer than he had to, and that was going to be a problem. Kedra was one of the greatest melee fighters I knew, turning the entire thing into a calculated dance of optimal efficiency and chess. Against Tuvalis, she was barely holding on. Not due to lack of skill. I could see in the video footage how she wove complex attacks and feints, each perfectly suited to counter and press against his strange weapon. Tuvalis's own motions were calm, collected and equally reactive. The problem is that Tuvalis didn't fight like a duelist. He fought like someone who would sell his own sister if it meant getting an extra 5 points in a match. Kedra could pull off deadly moves time and time again, and Tuvalis would turn invulnerable, letting the swing float past through him, before rematerializing and delivering his own attacks. Which meant if I had to fight him, even with the occult, my own chances of winning got thrown off the speeder the moment I grew too mentally fatigued to keep the occult going. I'd need to stack up more advantages. 2 knights against 1 feather and a small army of distractions was getting closer to an even fight, which wasn't the house motto. Fortunately, I didn't need to fight him 2-on-1. When I'd dropped down from the ceiling, Kedra's video feed wasn't the only one that snapped back into view. My boots took me directly to the whirlpool, following the flow of the water blindly in the white mist. The amount of metal sediment and flakes being churned through with the water still played havoc on the scanners, journey taking extra time before the wireframes appeared and more detailed topology showed up. That was to our advantage, since if our scanners couldn't see well through the water, neither could anyone else's. Glittering water flowed over the broken edge of the center, spinning wildly into a circle, the flood not quite falling down the way it should given there was nothing under but arid air all the way down to the desert strata under us. But on the side of the broken ground, just before the drop, I could see the hilt of a dagger submerged underwater, tilted down from the spinning throw that had embedded it inside. The relic weapon had been expertly thrown, gouging a deep hole into the rock for a few seconds until the blade shut off. Normally, a straight throw to keep the blade on target was the trained method, but with enough practice, throwing it into a spin would let the occult edge gouge a full cut before the blade shut off. And lodged right inside that cut was a familiar metal hook, trailing a taut rope, hidden under the rushing water. The line curling in an arc from the reduced gravity. Deeper in the vortex, a shadow was moving under it all, following the rope up, one arm at a time. Captain Sagrius hadn't let himself fall down all the way to the bottom strata. With Father's combat engram running paired with the speed and reflex of a relic armor, even an inhumanly perfect throw with both dagger and hook could be done. I kneeled down and grabbed the line, dragging it up, moving fast. I didn't need to go much. My target had been steadily fighting off several hundred tons of rushing water on its own, foot by foot, over this entire time. That added up. A helmet surfaced over the whirlpool, water parting around it, the colors and insignia of House Winterscar growing clear as the armor's shoulders and chest came up. It watched me silently, wordlessly pulling itself forward against the churn of the water while I did the same on the other side. Including the captain, it would be 2 elite knights and 1 occult spellcaster as support against Ivalice. With those odds, we could make something happen. Unfortunately, Ivalice wasn't an idiot. Behind. Father called out from the necklace around Sagrius's neck. He didn't need to tell me twice. I saw the ghost outline of Ivalice leaping straight for my position, sailing through the white mist. He'd disengaged from Kedra, leaving his minions to hold his spot while he ruined my plan. I tried frantically pulling Sagrius faster, which of course wasn't going to be anywhere near fast enough. So I did the next best thing and let my mouth have a stab at it. Might get the feather to start talking instead of fighting. Ivalice, you rat bastard, I said. We finally meet face to F. He landed with a splash behind me and wordlessly lifted a leg up for a savage kick, which would toss Wrath and I straight into the vortex at this angle. Alright, note to self. Taunting Ivalice is going to need some more creative thought than to sef it. I abandoned the line and twisted around at the same moment, a cold pulsing around me. My arm guard shield lit up, the mirror image charging out of my position, shield raised directly where his kick would have connected, onto the occult edges glowing bright. Ivalice changed his movement instantly, turning his raised kick into a heel stomp directly through the image's knee, right under the glowing occult edges on the arm guard and breaking the image apart. From that, he followed with a full kicker's swing, trying to punt me straight into the vortex again, no questions asked. Shields flared to life over my armor right before his kick landed. Journey buckled against 2 unyielding forces. The first was his stupidly strong kick to my stomach. The second was my hasty grab for the hook embedded deep into the ground. The relic armor strained, my chest rocketing to the side as my left hand held the grip, before the force backlashed through me, slamming me back down into the water and straight into the brick floor instead of being tossed into the abyss. Bits of red splattered the interior of my HUD, and I realized that had come from me. Bit my cheek or tongue during that, probably. Don't know, didn't have time to check either. Ivalice hadn't waited for me to get back up either. His free hand was already reaching straight for Wrath's exposed sack, her working eye staring down the approaching hand about to tear her head off. Fortunately, occult sight let me see in every direction, even if I was currently face planted directly into water. I snarled, spitting the rest of the blood for Journey to handle, triggering the occult again. Images flashed out, standing up far faster than I could, 3 swinging for him in every direction as I scrambled back on my feet. This close, caught in the middle of a bad position and with little room to maneuver, I knew I had the bastard dead to rights. He hissed, snatching his hand back before my images could cut it right off. More images blurred to life from the prior ones, forcing him to leap backwards out of range. My images chased after the bastard, relentless. Ivalice rapidly realized he couldn't just walk away from the images, they needed to be destroyed or I would never stop hounding after him. He twisted under the swing of one, a sharp elbow slamming the other side of the arm guard, breaking the image's cohesion. All the while he kicked the shin of another, causing it to vanish away from the impact, and caught the last one with his chain, scything right through the ribs. Evelys turned out to be a multitasker, given the chain not only ripped my last image apart, it swung directly at my position, unerringly zooming to my side just as I'd gotten back up. I didn't get the time to reach down a second time for the hook. I hardly had the time to curse before the mace end slammed dead on into my hastily raised arm guard. My shield held. And then the mace end exploded in an occult blast, knocking up and off my feet. Shields triggered, dispersing most of the shock but not without rattling my insides as if I were in a full-on speeder crash. Physics twirled Wrath and I around like a string toy, snapping the few remaining straps clean off as we tumbled through the air. She got flung further off to the walls, while I got sent way too close to the vortex edge. My armor hit the ground hard, sliding through the water like the world's deadliest game of sliding ice with absolutely nothing just a meter off my right. The maw of the vortex watched, hungry, as I slipped parallel to it, pleading that I'd bounce the wrong way and fall into its gullet. Its wish got granted. My armor slammed into an upturned rock and bounced me straight to the void. Keith! Kedra screamed out over comms, horrified. She was too far away, and too bogged down by Evelys's minions. In pure desperation, frantic hands shot out by sheer reflex, scrambling for anything I could grip. Slick rock was the only thing under me, my fingers uselessly gliding across the flooring as my feet, chest, and everything crossed over the edge. Fingers wrapped over the edge itself at the last moment, and I squeezed for everything I had in me. The armor instantly pitched straight down, the leftover force pushing me off, mixing with the rushing weight of angry water pitted against unyielding relic armor holding onto for my life. The armor won. Comms and video feeds began to fuzz as the water poured over my head, submerging me in the torrent. Close one, dearie. Cathida said, a nervous edge in her voice while the world had been cut off. If the gravity wasn't weakened here, that rock edge wouldn't support your weight and inertia from that. Don't let him get a second shot like this. The armor made pulling myself up easy, giving me a short jump up through the water, landing on the walkway edge with both feet. Cathida was right, I was quickly running out of luck. Few seconds with Evelys and I'd lost Wrath, then nearly got kicked into the vortex 3 times over. Rat bastard was going hard. Said bastard now strolled at the edge, clearly feeling far more confident in his odds, letting hot air vent off near his halo. The chain swinging lazily around his main hand, coming closer and closer to Sagrius's hook and line. The captain was nearly at the edge, wildly pulling against the cord, just about to reach solid ground. The chain made a quick twist, and scythed right through the rope as he passed by the hook. Evelys didn't even bother to look, violet eyes fixed on me the whole time. Fuck. My options came down to one possible choice. I could try to throw my own hook and rope at Sagrius and hope he'd grab hold of it. But Evelys was here, and protecting a rope against a monster like him was impossible. Distracting him by throwing random scrap shit wasn't going to work either, and neither trying to jump after the captain. He'd just take the opportunity to murder Wrath. Saving the captain had turned into an impossible task. In the soul trance, I could see the falling relic armor had also come to the same conclusion, knowing there was no possible way to return this time. But not the combat engram running deep inside the armor. His right hand snapped straight for the neckpiece and cleanly ripped it off its chain. A faceless helmet locked onto mine. It was a perfect toss, and Journey's gauntlet easily snatched the thrown necklace out of the air. The falling armor finally relaxed, as if content with these last actions, letting itself be dragged off with the current, vanishing under the waves. Video feed turned into a pixelated mess before going dark, signal lost from the occlusion in the water. A moment later, he was gone from even the occult sight, falling too far out of my range. Tuovilus watched from a distance, calculating the captain's final choices. A sentimental item? He asked, fishing for information. As a matter of fact, it's the heart of my family. I answered back, holding onto the little neckpiece in hand. A sigil of the clan. Feathers could detect lies with enough information to work with, and Evelys wouldn't have come here without that information. I had to lead him down the wrong conclusions. A weapon would have been more valuable to deliver. What could a cosmetic keepsake possibly do for you in this situation? I tossed the neckpiece into my shield hand, holding it tight. I took steady steps back to Wrath, drawing Atias's machine blade with my main hand, pointing directly at him. He allowed it. Think I'll sell it for a ration bar? Killing feathers really drives up a hunger, you know. Evelus watched intently as I took a position between him and wrath. I could tell from his gaze that whatever mechanical version of instinct he had, it was screaming there had to be a more important reason why the captain's final action had been to throw that instead of anything I could use. What Evelus couldn't have known yet is that the captain had thrown a weapon at me. The greatest weapon he had. Deep in the necklace, a soul fractal remained lit within, smoldering with fury.